Before Escobar, before El Chapo, there was Griselda Blanco, the godmother of Miami. She smuggled billions in cocaine, ordered over 200 murders, and ruled the streets with fear and blood. Hitmen, child assassins, public executions. She turned Miami into a war zone. They called her La Madrina. The DEA called her unstoppable. This is the story of the woman who built an empire and destroyed everything in her path. Griselda Blanco, queen-pin of cocaine and chaos. Chapter 1. Born into blood, the streets of Cartagena. She was only 11 years old the first time she put a gun to someone's head. The boy was barely older than her, maybe 13, skinny, terrified, begging for his life in a whisper. He'd stolen something small. Maybe it was money. Maybe a bag of clothes. The details had blurred with time, twisted by rumor. But what remained crystal clear, etched into the myth and the woman she would become, was what she did next. She pulled the trigger. In that moment, on a cracked Cartagena sidewalk drenched in humidity and silence, something inside her shifted. Or perhaps it was simply revealed. The world around her had always been brutal. She had just finally joined it. Griselda Blanco was not born into violence. She was forged in it. Cartagena in the late 1940s was a place of contradictions. A port city wrapped in Spanish colonial beauty, kissed by the Caribbean sun, and cursed by poverty, corruption, and neglect. Its wealthy enclaves clung to colonial charm, while the slums festered in rot and desperation. The line between the two wasn't just invisible, it was impassable, and that's where Griselda lived. In the places tourists never saw. In a broken home, down a dirt path lined with trash, where survival wasn't a goal, it was a daily miracle. She never knew her father, and the man who came and went, drunk, angry, often violent, wasn't much of a substitute. Her mother, Ana Lucia, was as cold as the concrete walls they slept against. She survived by hustling, lying, and selling her body. There was no space for affection, no time for stories or lullabies. The only lesson she passed on to her daughter was that the world is cruel, and if you want to survive, you must become crueler. Griselda learned fast. She was small, but her eyes told another story. Wide, black, and unblinking. The kids in the neighborhood said she never cried. Not when she fell. Not when she was hit. Not even when she was hungry, which was most of the time. She spent her early years on the streets, scavenging, pickpocketing, learning how to disappear. She would trail men from the docks, watching where they hid their cash, then sneak in behind them like a shadow with teeth. Other times, she'd flirt with sympathy, dirty-faced and barefoot, with the look of a child who had no one, because she didn't. But the moment someone looked away, her hands were in their pockets. The slums were a breeding ground for predators, and Griselda didn't just learn how to avoid them. She learned how to become one. There was a man, a foreigner, some said, a tourist. Others whispered he was a local with a taste for danger. No one remembered his name, only what he tried to do. Griselda was 10. He offered her candy, promised her a meal. She followed him into an alley, and when he grabbed her arm, she bit into his hand with animal fury. Broke skin, drew blood. She ran, came back later with a stolen pistol and a plan. The next time he came around, he disappeared. Some say she killed him. Others say she merely had him robbed, humiliated. Whatever the truth was, the message was clear. Griselda was not prey. Not anymore. By 11, she had joined a local gang made up of street kids and runaways. They weren't organized in any real way. They were desperate, angry, and hungry, just like her. They slept on rooftops, snuck into abandoned homes, ate whatever they could steal. Their crimes started small, but as they tasted power, the hunger changed. It wasn't about food anymore. It was about control, about fear. Griselda stood out, even then, not because she was smarter or stronger, but because she was willing to go further. She didn't hesitate. When others flinched, she acted. When others fled, she stepped forward. It was around that time she committed her first known murder. The boy she shot wasn't a stranger. He was one of them. He had stolen from the gang, hid some money, lied about it. The older boys were ready to beat him, teach him a lesson. Griselda had a different idea. She dragged him into the street in front of the others, put the gun in his mouth, pulled the trigger. No words, no emotion, just silence and a message. After that, they followed her. She wasn't their leader. Not officially, but everyone knew who made the decisions, who controlled the fear. She was 11 years old and already ruled her own corner of Cartagena. But even a queen of dirt has limits. The police didn't care about the slums unless bodies started piling up, and Griselda's gang made that happen. They were reckless, young, and high on their own myth. And the city began to notice. Not just the cops, but bigger predators. Men who ran actual operations. Smugglers, fixers, enforcers. They saw something in Griselda, something dangerous, raw, and useful. One of them approached her with a deal. Steal a shipment. Just a test. A few kilos of contraband moving through the docks. Nothing too risky. She accepted. Pulled it off with military precision. No blood spilled, no alarms. She was 12. That was her introduction to the drug world. Back then, it wasn't cocaine. Not yet. It was contraband, stolen goods, sometimes morphine or opium. The real product didn't matter. What mattered was that she proved herself. Proved she could be trusted. That she could think, plan, execute. And most importantly, she didn't talk. The older men liked that. But they underestimated her. Griselda wasn't interested in being a tool. She watched everything. How the routes worked, how the bribes were paid, who got rich, and who stayed poor. She asked questions others didn't. Listened to the silence between words. She wasn't just learning the business. She was preparing to run it. But Cartagena was only a beginning. A proving ground. A place soaked in blood and poverty where monsters were born and discarded. And Griselda Blanco was already outgrowing it. By 13, she had left home for good. Her mother didn't stop her. Didn't care. Maybe she was relieved. Maybe she was afraid. No one knows. The two would never speak again. Griselda moved inland, to Medellin, the heart of Colombia's growing underworld. A city that would, one day, become synonymous with death and cocaine. She didn't know it yet, but she was walking into history. Medellin was different. Bigger, meaner. The slums were higher up the mountains, the police more corrupt, the criminals more sophisticated. She found work in brothels, then in the black markets. Met men who knew men. Made herself useful. And then she met him. Carlos. Her first husband. A petty trafficker with big dreams and loose morals. He was older, charming in that dangerous way. She was still a teenager. But she had already seen too much to be fooled by soft words. What Carlos offered wasn't love, it was access. He introduced her to the real drug trade. Cocaine. A new gold rush rising from the Andes. Unlike opium or marijuana, cocaine was clean, profitable, and fast. Americans were falling in love with it, and dealers in Colombia were getting rich overnight. Griselda paid attention. She learned everything. How the leaves were processed, how the bricks were shaped and sealed, how to move product from jungle to port, from port to plane. She started running her own shipments. Small at first, then larger. She didn't just mimic the men around her. She outmaneuvered them, outsmarted them, outlasted them. By 17, she had already made her first real kill in the drug business. Not street justice, not desperation. A calculated hit on a rival smuggler who crossed her. No witnesses. No hesitation. Just a message, don't underestimate me. The message was received. But success in Colombia came with danger. The market was crowded. The violence escalating. And Griselda had bigger dreams. She didn't want to just be a player. She wanted to rule the game. And so, when the time came to flee Colombia, whether from heat, enemies, or simply ambition, she didn't hesitate. With forged papers, hidden cash, and a few trusted men, she boarded a plane for the United States. Destination, New York City. She stepped off the plane like a storm about to make landfall. What she would build in America would become legendary. What she would destroy would be immeasurable. But back in the slums of Cartagena, the girl who once pulled the trigger without blinking was already gone. In her place stood something else. And New York had no idea what was coming. Chapter 2. Theft, Kidnapping, and Murder. Her criminal adolescence. The gun was too big for her hands. Her fingers strained around the grip, trembling just enough to betray the storm inside. The boy kneeling in front of her couldn't have been older than 13. He was crying softly, muttering prayers between breaths, a thin ribbon of snot sliding down to his lip. His knees were scraped raw from the concrete. Blood trickled down his temple where someone had hit him with the butt of a pistol. Not her. Not yet. It was supposed to be a warning, a beating, a punishment for stealing from the gang. But Griselda had other plans. She raised the gun. There were voices behind her, confused, nervous. One boy even stepped forward, reaching for her arm. "What are you doing?" he whispered. She didn't answer. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes, empty, silent, locked onto the boy in front of her like a hawk circling prey. There was no anger in her face, no joy, just a brutal, clinical kind of focus. The kind you see in soldiers after too many tours. She pulled the trigger. The sound cracked through the alley like thunder. And just like that, the game changed. That killing didn't just make her feared. It made her unforgettable. Cartagena's slums were full of thieves, runaways, and broken children. Violence wasn't rare. But cold-blooded execution at the hands of an 11-year-old girl? That was different. That was legend. In the twisted hierarchy of street life, fear was currency. And Griselda Blanco had just made her first deposit. From that moment on, the older boys didn't question her. The younger ones followed her like disciples. She was no longer a girl surviving the streets. She was the streets, raw, ruthless, and unforgiving. The kind of child who looked at blood not with horror, but calculation. And she was only getting started. By 12, Griselda was orchestrating robberies with precision. Not smash and grabs, not clumsy assaults, strategic hits. She'd case markets for hours, watching merchants count their cash, tracking routines. Then she'd send in decoys, street kids who played dumb while she slipped behind counters and cleaned out the register. She didn't need to fight for scraps anymore. She was learning how to take whole meals. She robbed men twice her size and left them bleeding. Pickpocketed armed officers in broad daylight. Stole knives, watches, radios, anything she could flip for pesos. But it was never about the money. Not really. It was about dominance. Control. Power was addictive. And Griselda was hooked. Soon, the thefts weren't enough. There was a girl named Marta, barely 15, who worked for a bootlegger. Rumor was she'd been holding back product. Griselda confronted her one night outside a cantina, pulled her behind a shack, slapped her until the girl screamed, and demanded the truth. Marta spit in her face. She never made it home. Her body was found days later, floating near the docks. Throat slit, ankles bound with twine. No one saw who did it. No one asked. But whispers traveled like smoke, and everyone knew the fire at the center of it. Griselda wasn't just surviving anymore. She was sending messages. But perhaps the darkest turn came when she discovered the leverage of fear, not over enemies, but over strangers. People who had nothing to do with her world but could still be used like pawns on a board. That's when the kidnappings began. They started small, petty extortion. Griselda and her crew would target fruit vendors, small shop owners, street performers. Threaten them, shake them down, steal from their homes. But she saw how fear shifted when it involved family. How men who wouldn't flinch at a robbery would collapse at the idea of their daughter vanishing. So she tested it. Her first victim was the son of a butcher, a chubby 6-year-old named Luis. He disappeared walking home from school. No witnesses. No trace. Griselda didn't torture him. She didn't have to. She fed him, kept him hidden, even joked with him. But the message was clear. Pay, or he disappears forever. The butcher paid. Every peso he had. And when the boy was returned, he didn't say a word. No one knew who had taken him. But in the market, all eyes turned toward the girl with the unblinking stare who never begged, never cried, and never smiled. Her second kidnapping was more violent. This time, a wealthy merchant. His niece. A demand scrawled in blood on the wall of his storefront. The girl was found a week later in an abandoned building, shivering, starved, eyes hollow. The ransom had been paid. But Griselda had learned something deeper. Money wasn't the real prize. It was power. The ability to take something precious, hold it in your hands, and decide whether it lived or died. By 14, she had crossed lines most hardened criminals never dared. And yet, she wasn't chaotic. She was meticulous. Every crime had a reason. Every target served a purpose. Her violence wasn't random. It was math, cold, strategic, and ruthless. She carried a blade in her boot and a pistol in her waistband. Dressed in oversized clothes. Hair slicked back. Eyes unreadable. People twice her age would step aside when they saw her coming. Children ran when they heard her name. She was a ghost with a heartbeat. Never caught. Never questioned. Never forgiven. But even ghosts cast shadows. One afternoon, she was caught off guard. A rival crew, older boys from the neighboring barrio, ambushed her and her gang while they were splitting profits from a robbery. It wasn't a robbery, it was a message. She was beat within inches of her life, left in an alley with cracked ribs and blood on her teeth. She never reported it, never told anyone. Instead, she disappeared for 2 days. On the third, 2 of the boys who had attacked her were found hanging from a bridge. No one saw who did it. But on the 4th day, she returned to the same alley, sat in the same spot, and waited. When the last boy returned for his share, she stabbed him in the neck and walked away. No one tested her after that. It was around this time that she met men who weren't street punks. Men who didn't carry their power in fists, but in briefcases. Traffickers, brokers, people who moved weight, not in gold or currency, but in drugs. Mostly opium, some morphine, not yet cocaine. That would come later. They saw in her something rare, a mind for logistics and a stomach for violence. She started running errands for them. Deliveries, collections, extortion jobs. They called her La Pequeña Madrina, the little godmother. It was half mockery, half respect. She took it seriously. Her jobs grew. Her profits multiplied. She bought clothes, jewelry, a knife made of bone. She wore it at all times, even while she slept. But even as she climbed, she remained distant. Cold. She didn't laugh, didn't drink, didn't sleep with the men who tried to charm her. She wanted one thing, and it wasn't sex, money, or fame. She wanted control. She found it when she met a man twice her age, a small-time smuggler who offered her partnership. He brought the network. She brought the fear. Together, they built a pipeline of stolen goods running from the ports to the slums. And when he tried to betray her, tried to pocket extra profit behind her back, she slit his throat in his sleep and took everything. No warning, no hesitation. His crew folded into hers within hours. By the time she turned 15, Griselda Blanco had orchestrated thefts, kidnappings, and at least 5 murders. Her network stretched across multiple neighborhoods. She owned cops. She controlled territory. She could walk into any market and take whatever she wanted, and no one would say a word. But power comes with weight, and the weight was building. She began hearing rumors, whispers of police inquiries, names written down in ledgers, boys picked up and never seen again. The noose was tightening. But Griselda had no plans to die in the street like the rest of them. She wanted something bigger. She began asking about America. They called it the land of gold, a place where drugs could sell for 10 times the price, where violence wore suits and smiled behind glass towers, where a poor girl from the Colombian slums could become royalty if she was willing to kill for it. She forged papers, paid bribes, pulled favors, and one night, under a different name, wearing a new identity like armor, she boarded a plane to New York. The seat beneath her shook during takeoff. She didn't flinch. The lights of Cartagena faded behind her. Below, the ghosts of her victims whispered into the night. But she didn't look back. She had survived poverty. She had survived betrayal. She had become a legend. But what waited in America was not a new beginning. It was the evolution of something already monstrous. And New York wasn't ready for her. Chapter 3: Love and Cocaine. The birth of a drug queenpin. The first time she saw him bleed, she didn't flinch. She didn't panic. She didn't scream. She stared. He was on the kitchen floor, clutching his ribs, gasping through his teeth while blood soaked into the cheap linoleum tiles beneath him. The knife wound wasn't deep, but it was messy. The air stank of sweat and rum. Outside, a baby cried in the heat of a New York summer night. Griselda stood over him, calm as ice. "You're going to live," she said. He nodded, grimacing. "You stabbed me. You shouldn't have lied." He blinked, still dazed, unsure whether to laugh or fear her. That was the night he stopped calling the shots. And the night Griselda Blanco stopped pretending to be anyone's wife. They had met 3 years earlier, on the gritty edges of Queens, in the kind of bar where men bought dreams by the glass and paid for them with regret. He was older, street-savvy, part-time hustler, full-time charmer. He told her she had eyes like a wolf and a heart that didn't blink. She told him she wasn't looking for love, just an exit. Still, they danced, drank, fell into something twisted and magnetic. It wasn't romance. It was strategy disguised as chemistry. She needed connections. He needed muscle. Together, they looked like ambition wrapped in skin. He introduced her to cocaine. Not the way users met it, in dim corners and nightclub bathrooms, but the way traffickers saw it, as pure opportunity. A white powder that turned into gold the second it crossed borders. It was lighter than heroin, cleaner than marijuana, and carried none of the earthy smell. Easy to hide, easy to move, and more addictive than anything the American market had ever seen. He was moving small amounts then, just enough to impress low-level buyers. But the profits were instant. A kilo in Colombia cost pennies. In New York, it could sell for tens of thousands. He showed her how it worked, how to cut it, package it, and pass it, how to find buyers in clubs, bankers with dirty secrets, doctors with high-stress jobs, and low willpower. Cocaine didn't discriminate. It elevated the desperate and the wealthy alike. Griselda didn't just watch. She absorbed every detail, every price fluctuation, every smuggling tactic. She watched how couriers swallowed condoms full of coke and prayed they wouldn't burst, how suitcases were hollowed out, how cars were rigged, how shipping routes moved with the tide of corruption. And she saw the flaws in all of it. Men were sloppy, greedy, distracted by women and liquor. They bragged too much, left trails. She began taking control, quietly. At first, it was just accounting, tracking the money, tightening the expenses. Then she handled product, then distribution. By the time her husband realized what had happened, he was working for her. But with power came danger. Their apartment, a shoebox in Jackson Heights, became a storage unit for cash, coke, and weapons. She slept beside a sawed-off shotgun, hid stacks of bills and baby cribs. Every knock at the door made her reach for her belt. And yet, she thrived in the chaos. She gave birth to her second son during this time, alone in a hospital room, surrounded by nurses who didn't ask questions. Her husband was out, making deals that wouldn't last. She named the child Michael, held him against her chest, swore he would never know the hunger she had known. That promise would become her obsession. As her operation grew, so did the attention. Buyers multiplied, profits surged, but so did suspicion. Neighbors started whispering. Friends kept their distance. One morning, she returned to find the building swarmed with federal agents. Her front door was wide open. Her husband was gone. They didn't catch her that time. She had been smart, moved the stash days before. But the message was clear. New York was closing in. The heat wasn't just from the law. It was from rivals, too. Colombians, Puerto Ricans, Italians. Everyone wanted a piece. And no one wanted a woman calling the shots. She considered running. Then she considered something bolder. She looked south. Miami. In the late 60s, it was still sleepy compared to New York. But she saw what no one else saw. A coastline wide open for smuggling. Cuban connections ready for business. A city with just enough money, just enough rot, and just enough hunger to make it perfect. She packed what she could, money, product, children, and vanished overnight. The move wasn't quiet. Nothing about her ever was. But it was fast, and it was permanent. She landed in Miami with less than a dozen people loyal to her. No mansion, no cartel, just a vision, and the cold, ruthless discipline to make it real. She started with small deals. Nightclubs, hotel lobbies, backroom lounges where politicians, businessmen, and tourists all dipped their fingers into white powder and smiled like gods. Cocaine in Miami wasn't just a drug. It was a language, a passport, a status symbol. Griselda spoke it fluently. She charmed men with her smile and terrified them with her silence. She didn't bluff, didn't beg. When someone crossed her, they vanished. And when they tried to cheat her, she didn't forgive. One supplier shorted her 5 kilos. He was found in his car 3 days later, hands missing, tongue stuffed in his own pocket. Word spread fast. The godmother had arrived. They called her that behind her back at first, La Madrina. It sounded like folklore, like some ghost story whispered in dark corners. But the name stuck, and soon, it wasn't fear keeping her alive. It was respect. She partnered with Colombian growers, offered them more money than the cartels and none of the rules. She cut out middlemen, built her own pipelines, smuggled product in lingerie, diapers, statues, hired young girls, pregnant women, men in wheelchairs, anyone who wouldn't raise suspicion. She turned trafficking into theater, and no one saw the strings but her. Her second marriage, if you could call it that, was less about love and more about logistics. The man was Colombian, handsome, violent, ran a mid-level distribution ring. She seduced him, then absorbed his network. By the time he realized what had happened, his lieutenants answered to her. He tried to fight back, threatened her with violence. She smiled, invited him to dinner, poisoned his wine. He died choking on his own breath while she ate calmly across the table. She buried him quietly, told the police he choked on a bone. They didn't ask questions. She wore black for a week, then returned to business. Griselda Blanco wasn't just building an empire. She was the empire. Every dollar that passed through Miami's nightclubs, every gram that glittered under fluorescent lights, every addict who danced until sunrise, they all fed her machine. And yet, she never lost sight of the one rule that had guided her since the slums of Cartagena. Control everything. She didn't trust accountants, didn't use banks. She counted her money herself every night, stacked it in walls, stuffed it into teddy bears, used it to bribe cops, judges, airport security. Everyone had a price, and she was willing to pay it until she didn't have to. Then she paid in blood. One by one, her rivals fell. Some disappeared. Some exploded. She didn't flinch. She didn't gloat. To her, it was arithmetic. Business. Keep the pipeline flowing. Keep the fear alive. But power has a price. She couldn't sleep. Kept a gun under her pillow. Moved houses every month. Paranoia was no longer a symptom. It was a survival skill. Her children grew up surrounded by bodyguards and whispers. They didn't ask where the money came from. Didn't question the rules. They just obeyed. Because the look in their mother's eyes told them what they needed to know. She would kill for them. And kill them, if necessary. Love, in Griselda's world, was not warmth. It was a contract. One you honored with loyalty, or died for breaking. And somewhere in the cold steel of that philosophy, she found her identity. She was no longer the barefoot girl with a blade in her boot. She was a mother, a killer, a queenpin. And she had only just begun to show the world what she was capable of. But the cocaine trade in Miami was about to explode, and the violence would make what she'd seen in Colombia look like a dress rehearsal. Because as her power grew, so did her enemies. And one of them was already watching. Chapter 4. The Escape to America, from Medellin to Miami. The plane touched down just after midnight. The runway lights blinked in the distance like a secret code, and the cabin buzzed with the soft tension of arrival. Nervous chatter, the clink of ice in plastic cups, and the creak of worn-out wheels meeting American soil. Griselda sat near the back, silent. Her face was emotionless, unreadable, but her mind was sharp and alive. Every second of that flight had been a risk. Every form filled out, every question at the customs desk, a test. But now she was in. Not just in the United States. She was inside the market. America, the land of opportunity, they said. But for her, it was something different. It was a jungle of golden arteries, clubs, ports, banks, and boulevards, pulsing with the one thing that moved faster than blood: cocaine. She stepped into the humid Miami night not as a refugee or a hopeful immigrant, but as a predator unleashed. Back in Medellin, the walls had been closing in. Her name was whispered too often, too loudly. She had made enemies with the wrong people, powerful ones. Her ruthlessness had built her reputation, but also painted a target on her back. And in the world she came from, reputation was a fragile crown. One mistake, one betrayal, and the same people who once kissed your ring would slit your throat without hesitation. There were rumors of a hit. Men watching her movements. A shipment intercepted. One of her lieutenants tortured and dumped outside a pharmacy. His eyes missing. The message was clear: get out or get buried. She didn't need to be told twice. Escape was never a desperate act for her. It was strategy. While others ran in chaos, she moved with purpose. She bribed the right officials, paid for forged documents, not just for herself, but for her family. 3 children, each given new names, new birth dates, a new future. She boarded that flight with a suitcase full of cash, diamonds sewn into a baby's blanket, and one promise echoing in her mind: they won't follow me to America. Not yet. In Medellin, her story had begun with scraps, robberies, violence, whispers of ambition. But she had grown fast, too fast, and the city, for all its blood and power, was a battlefield already claimed by men who would never allow a woman, especially one from the slums, to rise unchecked. Miami offered something different. It was unclaimed territory, still sleepy in the early 70s, more known for retirees and orange juice than organized crime. But beneath its surface, there was hunger, a restlessness. Cubans, Colombians, Dominicans, all trying to carve out a piece of the American dream. And Griselda saw it for what it really was, a blank canvas. She didn't come to start over. She came to conquer. At first, she lived quietly. A modest apartment in the suburbs. Children enrolled in school. A car that didn't draw attention. She wore plain clothes, avoided crowds, and spoke softly when she spoke at all. But beneath the quiet, she was moving, calculating. She studied the streets like a scientist studies disease. Who bought? Who sold? Where did the money flow? Which clubs had new faces and which bars had nervous ones? She listened for accents, looked for connections to Colombia. She went to beauty salons and heard women whisper about cousins still doing business back home. She went to bakeries and heard men talk about product without ever saying what it was. She found her people, and through them, she found opportunity. The U.S. was still in the early stages of cocaine obsession. Marijuana and heroin dominated headlines. Cocaine was a rich man's drug, a party indulgence. But Griselda knew better. She had seen what it could do, how it made dealers rich overnight and customers desperate within weeks. She started small, kilos at a time, hidden in car doors, in fake-bottom suitcases, in hollowed-out religious statues. The risk was enormous, but the profit was obscene. What cost a few $100s in Colombia could flip for tens of thousands in Miami. She turned each shipment into more infrastructure, more couriers, more stash houses. She recruited women, young, attractive, innocent-looking, mothers, nannies, tourists. They didn't look like smugglers. That was the point. She trained them, paid them well, and made it clear: betray her, and your family will suffer. Fear was a currency, and she minted it by the hour. Her network grew fast, faster than anyone expected. She didn't need flashy deals or public executions. She moved in shadows, quiet violence, precise threats. She paid off customs agents, bought silence from airport staff, even had doctors on payroll to prescribe tranquilizers to her mules before flights. She built an empire of ghosts, faceless, silent, efficient, and always, she stayed just out of reach. By the mid-70s, Griselda was moving hundreds of kilos a month. She had lieutenants managing different sectors of Miami, cutthroat enforcers to keep her operation tight, laundering networks in place to clean the tidal wave of cash flooding in. She bought properties under fake names, owned warehouses, had multiple passports. To the outside world, she was a businesswoman, private, mysterious. To those inside the underworld, she was a force of nature, a hurricane dressed in gold. But power draws attention, and Griselda was beginning to catch the eye of law enforcement. The DEA was starting to notice the influx of cocaine. A new drug culture was taking over Miami's nightlife, and overdose deaths were starting to rise. They didn't have names yet. Not for the bosses. Just rumors. Whispers of a Colombian woman who never flinched, who ran her business like a cartel, but lived like a ghost. They called her the Black Widow. Some said she'd already buried 2 husbands. Others said she'd ordered hits from her kitchen while stirring soup for her children. She liked the stories. Let them grow. Because while they watched her shadow, she was expanding her reach. She connected with suppliers back in Medellin, men desperate for US dollars and safe channels. She offered them both. Guaranteed safe delivery. Paid on time. No middlemen. No games. Her network was more reliable than theirs. And she had something they didn't. America. It wasn't just about smuggling anymore. It was about owning the market. Controlling every gram from jungle to nose. Griselda wanted to be the bridge and the gatekeeper. No one would move product without her blessing. And if they tried, they'd vanish. She started testing her muscle. A rival crew was moving small batches through the port without permission. She warned them once. The next time, she sent men with silenced pistols. 3 bodies. 1 survivor. The message echoed louder than a headline. She didn't tolerate independence. Even her allies knew better than to speak her name lightly. Her loyalty was razor thin. One misstep, and she'd cut ties and throats. But behind the violence was something deeper. A philosophy. Griselda saw the drug trade not just as crime, but as evolution. The weak perish. The smart rise. The cold survive. She had survived Cartagena. Survived betrayal. Escaped Medellin. Built an empire in a foreign land, in a man's world, with no map and no mercy. But power, like cocaine, is addictive. And Griselda was already showing signs of overindulgence. She stopped trusting lieutenants. Moved her children constantly. Slept with a pistol under her pillow. Paranoia wrapped itself around her spine like a second skin. She began lashing out for smaller infractions. Hires were tortured for rumors. Mistakes were treated as betrayal. The walls were closing in, and she didn't even see them yet. Still, in the eyes of the world, she was winning. The queenpin of Miami. The cocaine matriarch. She sat in the center of a storm she had created, driven by money, fear, and the kind of ambition that leaves no room for softness. But Miami was about to change. The city's nightlife was turning into a battleground. More players were arriving. The Medellin cartel itself had started sending representatives, and some of them weren't interested in playing by her rules. One of them, in particular, had a plan. And Griselda, for all her genius, never saw him coming. Chapter 5. Cocaine Pipeline. Building the blood trail. The woman was sweating. Not from the heat, though the Miami sun pressed down like judgment. She was sweating because she had 5 condoms full of cocaine inside her stomach, 2 more taped beneath her breasts, and a 1,000-yard stare that begged for mercy. She'd just landed from Bogota, walking stiffly through customs, praying every second that her body wouldn't betray her. Behind mirrored sunglasses and a soft accent, the officer waved her through. She didn't look like a trafficker. That was the point. She wasn't. She was a mother of 2, promised a better life and $5,000 to carry a miracle in white. What she didn't know was that if even one of those condoms burst inside her, it wouldn't just be a ruined job. It would be a death sentence. But Griselda Blanco didn't care. She didn't know the woman's name. Didn't need to. To her, they were just vessels. Tools in a machine. Each one part of a living, breathing pipeline. A human blood trail stretching from the coca fields of Colombia to the neon veins of Miami's underworld. And Griselda was the architect. Her empire was built on innovation. Not flashy violence. Not brute force. At least not yet. But on cleverness. Strategy. While other smugglers moved kilos in trucks or suitcases, she turned the human body into a shipping container. Women became mules. Children became decoys. Even pregnant women were used, bellies padded with plastic-wrapped bricks, dresses stitched with grams along the seams. Cocaine didn't just move. It traveled. Like a phantom. Like a whisper. And every whisper made her richer. She discovered early on that the best disguise was innocence. Young girls in heels. Housewives in sun hats. Tourists in floral skirts. All trained to smile, nod, and blend in. They passed through security like shadows, carrying death behind lipstick and fake smiles. It wasn't about loyalty, it was about desperation. Griselda preyed on it. She found her mules in poor neighborhoods, in beauty parlors, in bars where the rent was overdue and hope had packed up months ago. She promised them cash. A way out. A new beginning. Some believed her. Most didn't return. But for everyone who disappeared, there were 5 more lined up to take her place. The system was brutal, but efficient. A mule might carry 2 or 3 kilos per trip. Multiply that by 10 couriers a week, and suddenly, you're looking at hundreds of kilos flooding into America without a single shot fired. But Griselda didn't stop at bodies. She pushed further, built tricks into bras, shoes, diaper bags. She paid seamstresses to redesign undergarments with secret pockets. She paid smugglers to hide bricks inside hollowed-out statues, fake televisions, even dog kennels. She once sent a shipment in a hollowed-out wheelchair, pushed by a man who pretended to be paralyzed. No one questioned it. That was her genius. Every object was a weapon. Every person, a pawn. But it wasn't without risk. One woman, no older than 20, died mid-flight when a capsule burst inside her. Her heart exploded in her chest. The crew thought she was having a seizure. By the time they landed, she was already blue. Griselda never flinched. She paid someone to clean the body, retrieve the unruptured capsules, and moved on. No funeral. No phone call to the family. Just another lost vessel on the ocean of cocaine. She kept records, but never on paper. Everything was in her head. Names, dates, shipments. She didn't trust anyone with the numbers. Not even her closest lieutenants. That knowledge was her lifeline, her leverage. And still, the pipeline expanded. What started as runs from Colombia to New York now branched into California, Chicago, Dallas. She smuggled through commercial flights, private charters, even cargo ships. She paid off baggage handlers, immigration agents, and airline officials. Everyone had a price. And if they didn't, she found someone else. The money flowed in like a tidal wave. Fast, relentless, untraceable. Griselda laundered it through shell companies, fake real estate deals, nightclubs, and offshore accounts. Her network stretched from the jungles of Medellin to the cocktail bars of South Beach. And she watched it all from a distance, like a queen behind glass. Untouchable, cold, in control. But not everything was running smoothly. Competitors were beginning to notice. Small-time dealers, mid-level traffickers, they were being crushed. Drowned out by her product, her reach, her reputation. And some of them didn't want to bow. She sent a message. A rival crew had been stealing from her, skimming off shipments, reselling coke under their own label. Griselda invited the boss to dinner. Sat across from him at a candlelit table. Served wine. Talked business. Then, without blinking, she ordered his mistress strangled in the next room, and had the sound piped into the stereo. He folded immediately. Her terror wasn't just about punishment, it was about precision. A demonstration of control so complete, it felt supernatural. The DEA, meanwhile, was growing more suspicious. They couldn't pin her, but they saw the signs. The overdose spikes. The increase in violence. The whispers from informants too scared to name her directly. They started calling her La Madrina, the Godmother. And the nickname spread like wildfire. It suited her. She didn't just lead a crew, she ran an empire. One bound by blood, fear, and powder. And still, she wanted more. She began investing in her own coca fields back in Colombia. Sent trusted men to oversee production. She no longer wanted to buy product. She wanted to own it, start to finish. She cut deals with rebels, bribed local police, even flirted with politicians. Her reach was so deep, so quiet, that at times it felt like the air itself carried her name. But empires cast long shadows. Her mules were getting sloppy. One woman panicked during a customs inspection and collapsed, screaming. Another was caught with 4 bricks hidden in a baby stroller. Interrogations followed. Some talked, some didn't. But the pressure was mounting. Griselda didn't trust anyone now. She rotated couriers constantly, changed smuggling patterns, changed houses, phones, even aliases. She lived like a ghost, present everywhere, but nowhere at once. And then, she made a mistake. A man she trusted, a cousin of a former lover. He was supposed to deliver a shipment to Dallas, 20 kilos, stuffed in the walls of a van. He never arrived. The van was found abandoned. The coke was gone, and so was he. Griselda sent her best enforcer. 3 days later, the man was found in a motel bathtub, fingers missing, teeth shattered, throat slit open like a letter. On the mirror, in lipstick, one word: traitor. Traitor. The warning wasn't for him. It was for everyone else. No one double-crosses Griselda Blanco and walks away breathing. Still, the pipeline didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Cocaine had become a monster, and she was riding its back. Every week, more flights, more mules, more risk, and more blood. The violence in Miami was beginning to spill into the daylight. Shootings outside strip malls, car bombs in suburban driveways, children caught in the crossfire. The city, once a sun-drenched paradise, was turning into a war zone. And at the heart of it all was a woman whose empire flowed like a river of white. The money was immeasurable. Tens of millions, maybe hundreds. She stashed it in walls, buried it in yards, hid it in suitcases stored in warehouses that only she knew about. She paid accountants to move it, hide it, clean it. But she didn't trust them, either. She once shot a bookkeeper in the leg just for asking about missing invoices. She didn't need records. She had fear. And as long as that fear held, her pipeline would run clean and strong. But there was one thing she couldn't control: the eyes starting to close in on her. The DEA wasn't the only one watching now. Colombian cartels, larger, more organized, with military-grade firepower, had taken notice of the woman ruling Miami. And some of them didn't like what they saw. She was making too much, too fast, without permission. In the world of drug lords, that wasn't just ambition, it was a provocation. One man in particular, young, ruthless, born in Medellin, was rising through the ranks. And he wanted what she had. Chapter 6. The Queen of New York. Her rise in the 1970s. She stepped over the body like it was trash. Blood still wet on the floor. The man's eyes frozen open in terror, lips parted mid-plea. One shot through the chest. Two in the face. He hadn't even reached for his gun. Griselda lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly. "Next time," she whispered. "Believe me the first time." Her crew didn't flinch. No one spoke. No one moved. That was how she ruled New York, like a storm that didn't need thunder to be deadly. By the early 1970s, cocaine was trickling into the city's nightlife like a whispered secret. At first, it was a luxury, something sniffed behind velvet curtains by Wall Street brokers and fading rock stars. But Griselda saw it for what it really was: a tidal wave waiting to be unleashed. And she planned to be the one riding it. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was a name, a presence. The woman from Colombia who didn't ask for permission. The one who landed in Queens with 2 suitcases and turned them into a kingdom built on white dust. She understood New York better than most who were born there. It was a city that never blinked, never paused. Everything moved fast: money, cars, people, death. If you hesitated, you vanished. If you lied, you bled. And Griselda never hesitated. She started with clubs. Tiny basements in Spanish Harlem. Lounges in the Bronx. Corner bars near Flatbush. She sent her dealers out like seeds, quiet, watchful, calculating. They sold clean coke. Pure. Untouched. Not cut with baking soda or baby laxatives like the others were pushing. It didn't take long for the buzz to build. Buyers lined up. First in the shadows. Then openly. Griselda's name moved faster than her product. The Colombians called her La Madrina. The Americans called her the Queen of New York. She didn't correct either. She leaned into both. Because names were power, and she was already building something bigger than a drug ring. She was building fear. Every operation needed rules. And hers were simple. Be loyal. Be silent. Be useful. If you failed, you didn't get a second chance. Not with her. One mule miscounted the money. Off by $2,000. A mistake, maybe even honest. Griselda didn't care. She invited the woman over. Poured her a drink. Smiled. And then shot her in the stomach. It took her 15 minutes to die. No one ever miscounted again. But violence wasn't her first weapon, it was her last. What made her dangerous was how she could walk into a room and make a man second-guess his own heartbeat. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She just watched. Like a predator with all the time in the world. Her rivals underestimated her. They saw a woman. A foreigner. Soft hands and lipstick. They didn't understand until it was too late. She bought out suppliers. Bribed airport officials. even had NYPD officers on her payroll. She kept her children in private schools and her enemies in shallow graves. She operated like a chess master, always 3 moves ahead. And when someone got close, she didn't push back. She vanished, then came back stronger. The Italian mob started to feel it. Their grip on the city's drug trade had been slipping for years. Cocaine wasn't their game. They were stuck on heroin, numbers, gambling. Griselda's empire was younger, faster, bloodier. And she didn't play by their rules. A sit-down was arranged. She wore all black. No jewelry. Just a stare that turned mouths dry. The Italians expected negotiation. Griselda offered terms. A partnership, she said. You stay in your lane. I stay in mine. We make money. No one dies. They laughed. She didn't. The next week, 2 of their couriers were found shot in the head in a car outside the Bronx. In the back seat was a single rose and a brick of cocaine, untouched. Message received. The Italians didn't come after her again. They didn't shake her hand, either. But they stepped aside. Let the Queen of New York build her empire while they tended to their shrinking turf. Her network stretched into Queens, Manhattan, Brooklyn. She had stash houses every few blocks. Laundromats that washed more money than clothes. Taxi services that doubled as delivery routes. Nail salons where messages were passed in coded phrases. She didn't just control the cocaine, she was cocaine. And New York was hooked. But success comes with shadows. The DEA started connecting the dots. Too many busts, too many dead dealers. All of them linked back to the same name. No fingerprints. No direct evidence. Just whispers. She was becoming legend, and that made her a target. Surveillance began. They tapped phones, followed cars, watched her movements. But Griselda was slippery. She didn't use phones. She didn't write things down. She didn't trust anyone, not fully. Even her closest soldiers were kept in the dark, only told what they needed to know. She moved like smoke through locked doors. Still, she felt it. The pressure, the eyes, the way certain cars parked too long outside her building, the way strangers lingered too close. She didn't panic. She planned. If New York was getting too hot, then maybe it was time to spread the fire somewhere else. But she had unfinished business. One crew, a Dominican outfit, was undercutting her prices, pushing watered-down coke on her turf. She warned them once. They laughed, said she didn't run the whole city. She didn't argue. She waited. 2 weeks later, their top man was found hanging from a bridge in Washington Heights. His mouth stuffed with fake bills. His eyes burned out with acid. No one laughed after that. The streets whispered her name like a prayer and a curse. Mothers warned their sons not to get involved with her. Girlfriends begged their boyfriends to find safer work. But the money was too good, and the Queen of New York was too powerful to resist. Even those who feared her wanted to be near her. She walked into rooms like gravity itself, pulling everyone's focus, stealing their breath. Some men fell in love with her. Some women hated her, but all of them obeyed. Still, she kept moving. Never slept in the same place twice. Trusted no locks. Trusted no friends. She was her own security system, her own general, her own god. But her time in New York was running thin. A cousin was arrested on gun charges. One of her mules got sloppy, tried to flip. He was found floating in the East River. But the feds were getting closer. They had names now. Associates. Patterns. And Griselda could feel the walls tightening. She gathered her children. Made plans. Miami was already humming. The cocaine scene there wasn't just growing. It was exploding. Nightclubs filled with white powder and white lies. Corrupt officials. Open coasts. It wasn't a risk. It was an invitation. She left New York quietly. No farewell party. No big send-off. Just one final drop, a few silent executions, and a city left gasping in her wake. But the legend didn't die. Even after she left, the streets still echoed her name. The Queen of New York, more myth than flesh. A woman who walked through fire and left no ashes. But Miami was different. Wilder. Younger. Unclaimed. And Griselda was already planning how to turn it into her next kingdom. The throne was waiting. And the first war had already begun. Chapter 7. The Move to Miami. Entering the cocaine capital. The engine purred low as the motorcycle crept along the curb, its rider steady, faceless behind a tinted visor. At the cafe on Southwest 8th Street, no one noticed. The afternoon was hot, the air thick with sweat and exhaust. Laughter, clinking plates, the usual noise of a neighborhood pretending everything was fine. Then came the gunfire. Short, sharp bursts from an Uzi, 12 rounds in under 4 seconds. The man at the center table jerked, convulsed, then collapsed in his chair. Blood spilled down his chest, soaking into the white linen. The shooter didn't slow, didn't look back. The motorcycle veered into traffic and vanished, swallowed by the Miami heat. The man had been warned, told to pay up, told to stay in line. He didn't listen. Now he was dead, and Griselda Blanco had officially arrived. Miami in the early 1980s was a dream dressed in neon and cocaine dust, a place where palm trees swayed above nightclubs that never closed, and ocean breezes carried secrets instead of salt. The money was so thick, so fast, that banks stopped asking questions. You could walk in with a suitcase of cash and walk out with a deed to a strip mall. But beneath the glamour, the city was bleeding. Every week brought a new body. Shot in a parking lot. Dumped in a canal. Left for dead in a shopping plaza. They called it the cocaine cowboy era, but it was never a game. It was a war. And no one fought it like Griselda. She didn't sneak into Miami. She invaded it. Her arrival wasn't subtle. She brought dozens of foot soldiers, couriers, lovers, and killers. Flew in from New York with her kids in tow and plans already drawn. The city had no idea what was coming. Her first order of business was to secure territory. She found safe houses in Kendall, stash pads in Hialeah, and warehouses near the port. She bribed dock workers and airport handlers. She paid local cops to look the other way and hitmen to make sure no one looked too long. The pipeline was already built. New York had trained her to move with discipline. But Miami was a different animal. Hotter, looser, faster. She adjusted quickly. Smuggling intensified. Her planes came in low over the Everglades. Her couriers hidden in boats, trucks, and even children's toys. Anything could hold cocaine if you were bold enough to try. And Griselda was bold. She didn't just push product, she flooded the city. Her cocaine was cheaper, purer, and more reliable than anyone else's. Dealers lined up for a taste of the Queen's supply. Even rivals quietly bought from her when their own shipments failed to land. But cocaine was only part of her business. Fear was the rest. In a city already drowning in violence, Griselda introduced a new kind of terror, one that was personal, targeted, and theatrical. She turned murder into ritual. Drive-bys weren't random, they were choreographed. Every killing sent a message. Every bullet was signed with her silence. A man failed to deliver payment. His wife was shot in front of their child. A rival tried to steal territory. His house was firebombed with him still inside. A courier was suspected of talking. He was found hanging from an overpass, throat slashed, tongue missing. Griselda didn't punish mistakes. She erased them. The violence spread like wildfire. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Funeral homes ran out of space. Local news struggled to keep up. One week, it was a double execution in Little Havana. The next, a daylight massacre on Coral Way. Residents stopped asking why and started asking who's next. Miami was paralyzed, and law enforcement was scrambling. The DEA knew her name. So did the FBI. But pinning anything on her was like trying to grab smoke. She never touched the product, never signed a check, never held a weapon in public. She ran everything from behind curtains, surrounded by men who would die for her and women who would never speak. She moved like a ghost wrapped in diamonds. And yet, behind the power, there was paranoia. She didn't sleep much, trusted no one fully, switched homes constantly. Some nights, she stayed in a mansion in Coconut Grove. Other nights, she vanished into a rundown motel under a fake name. She was everywhere and nowhere, always watching, always waiting, and always ready to strike. One of her own lieutenants, a man who had handled shipments for years, was suspected of plotting with the Medellin cartel behind her back. Griselda invited him to dinner, served wine, laughed like old friends. He never made it to dessert. His body was found 2 days later in a canal, hands bound, face wrapped in plastic. The message was clear. You don't cross La Madrina. Not even once. Still, The war raged on. Other traffickers tried to challenge her. New cartels emerged, hungry for a slice of Miami's riches. But Griselda had already sunk her roots too deep. Her network extended through every inch of the city, strip clubs, banks, even funeral parlors. She had men inside the Port Authority, eyes inside customs. She paid priests to bless her shipments and hitmen to bury her secrets. And her money? It flowed like the tide. She laundered it through car dealerships, beauty salons, and offshore accounts. She buried stacks of cash in the walls of her homes. She bought diamonds, cars, yachts, anything that could be resold or hidden. At one point, her daily earnings were estimated at over $2 million per day. But money wasn't her drug. Control was. She didn't just want to rule Miami. She wanted to own it, to carve her name into the city's bones. And for a moment, she did. There were whispers that even politicians feared her, that some judges had her number on speed dial, not to call, but to avoid. She was power in heels, and she was untouchable. Until one day, she wasn't. In a downtown courtroom, a young assistant U.S. attorney held up a stack of sealed files. Evidence, he claimed. Informants were flipping. Wiretaps were coming together. Griselda wasn't named. Not yet. But the storm was forming. She felt it. The tightening grip. The nervous voices. The way even her most loyal soldiers avoided her gaze. She doubled down. Harsher punishments, stricter rules, deeper paranoia. One of her own sons had to beg her to stop killing people in broad daylight. But it was too late. Griselda had built her empire on blood. And blood, in the end, always wants more. On a warm April morning, two of her enforcers were gunned down outside a car wash in Little Haiti. The attackers used military-grade weapons. Clean exit. No survivors. No witnesses. The killings bore a signature Griselda recognized, but not her own. The cartel had arrived. Bigger, smarter, meaner. And they weren't there to ask permission. Griselda's grip on Miami wasn't slipping. It was being ripped from her hands. And she was about to fight for it the only way she knew how. With bullets, betrayal, and an even bigger pile of bodies. Chapter 8. The Cocaine Cowboys Era. Fast cars, fast deaths. The first shot cracked through the humid Miami air like a lightning bolt. It came from a silenced Mac 10, fired from the window of a red Ford van rolling up slowly outside Dadeland Mall. In broad daylight. In front of terrified shoppers clutching their kids. The target was standing by his car, didn't even have time to scream before his body was riddled with bullets. A second man tried to run. He didn't get far. The shooter leapt from the van, finished him off with 2 close-range rounds, then disappeared back inside the vehicle. They left a trail of casings behind like breadcrumbs. Inside the van, police later found a small arsenal, machine guns, pistols, ammo, even grenades. It looked less like a hit and more like a mobile armory. But this wasn't a war zone overseas. This was Miami in 1979. And this was the world Griselda Blanco helped create. They called it the Cocaine Cowboys Era, part because of the flashy cars and designer suits, but mostly because it was the Wild West all over again. Only this time, the Outlaws had Uzis instead of 6-shooters, and their horses were Porsches and Ferraris. And at the center of it, orchestrating the bloodshed with cold precision, was a woman who didn't blink when bodies fell. Griselda hadn't just arrived in Miami, she'd ignited it. Like gasoline on a brush fire. The early cocaine scene in the city was wild, but fragmented. Small-time pushers, scattered networks, isolated violence. But Griselda brought something different. She brought structure, vision, and war. When she landed in Florida, she didn't ask who ran what. She simply took it, one corner at a time, one life at a time. And when people resisted, she made examples. She didn't just send a message, she carved it into concrete. A rival refused to pay a debt. He and his wife were executed in their car, the infant in the back seat left alive, crying, covered in blood. A dealer shorted a shipment. His mother's house exploded 2 nights later. A courier talked to the cops. He disappeared completely. Her brand wasn't just cocaine. It was chaos. The drug wasn't just addictive, it was contagious. Cocaine moved through Miami's bloodstream like a virus. From nightclubs to back alleys. From banker parties to high school bathrooms. It blurred lines between rich and poor, sinner and saint. Everyone wanted it, and Griselda made sure everyone got it. At a cost. With the money came the violence. More shipments meant more competition. More competition meant more blood. Shootouts weren't rare, they were routine. Not in dark alleys or empty lots, but in parking lots, restaurants, intersections. In 1979 alone, Miami recorded over 300 drug-related homicides. Most of them unsolved. Most of them point-blank executions. And most of them linked, one way or another, to the cocaine pipeline Blanco had helped build. She was the queen, but her kingdom was on fire. Still, she thrived in it. Fast cars became her calling card. White Rolls-Royces, black Mercedes, Jaguars with tinted windows and hidden compartments. Her drivers were former soldiers. Her shooters were former cartel men. Her inner circle called her La Madrina, with the same reverence they might use for a saint or a witch. She ruled from the shadows, but her legend was everywhere. To the public, she was invisible. No mugshots, no headlines, just a name whispered in fear, like a ghost you pray never comes knocking. But to those in the business, she was a storm in heels. A force of nature with no moral compass and an appetite for violence. And she wasn't done. Griselda started importing her own product directly from Colombia, bypassing middlemen. She negotiated with plantation owners and cartel liaisons. She expanded routes through the Caribbean. Some shipments came by boat. Some by private planes landing in swampy airstrips under moonlight. Some, smaller, riskier runs, were swallowed by mules and flown into Miami International. Every route had its price, and every mistake had a cost. One of her pilots veered off schedule. The plane crashed in the Everglades. The wreckage was found by locals. The cargo? Gone. She didn't wait for an explanation. She sent 2 men to the pilot's family. They never came back. Even when she smiled, there was something in her eyes, cold, dead stillness. Like the ocean before a hurricane. She didn't flinch when others did. That's what terrified people most. Even the cartels in Colombia started to worry. She was making too much noise, drawing too much heat. DEA raids, media attention. The Medellin massacre had been a wake-up call, one they couldn't afford. Cocaine was still supposed to be a business, not a bloodbath. But Griselda didn't care. She wasn't in it for balance. She was in it for domination. The cocaine Cowboys era wasn't just about money. It was about myth. And she was building hers one corpse at a time. Her lieutenants drove Lamborghinis and wore gold watches. They carried briefcases full of cash and kept silenced pistols in glove compartments. They threw parties that ran for days, full of women, liquor, and fear. Loyalty was measured not in time, but in willingness to kill. The DEA scrambled to keep up. Agents were working around the clock, building profiles, following leads, flipping low-level dealers. But Griselda never stayed in one place. Her orders came down like commandments, from behind veils, through whispers. She used nicknames, burner phones, codes so obscure they sounded like riddles. Even when they had names, they had no proof. They called her the Black Widow, not just for her ruthlessness, but because every man who got close seemed to end up dead. And yet, she was a mother. She had children, kept them close, showered them with gifts, jewelry, clothes, cash. But even they weren't safe from her wrath. She once beat her son's friend with a pistol because he let a stash go missing. No one was safe. She didn't build an empire of trust. She built one of fear. And like all empires built on fear, it began to splinter. Her own men started watching each other. Paranoia spread. Everyone wondered who would be next. Because in Griselda's world, the difference between family and foe was one rumor away. Still, the money kept flowing. At her peak, she was reportedly clearing over $80 million a month. That's not profit, that's rain. She owned mansions in Coral Gables, safe houses in the Keys, apartments under fake names. Her bank accounts overflowed. Her closets lined with mink, silk, leather. She once bought an entire boutique just to avoid trying things on in public. And yet, the violence never stopped. Miami was bleeding from both wrists. Funeral homes stayed full. Hospitals became trauma centers. Police started wearing bulletproof vests just to write tickets in certain neighborhoods. The cocaine cowboys weren't hiding anymore. They were the new royalty. And Griselda? She was the queen with the bloodiest crown. But the very chaos she had unleashed was starting to turn inward. Her hits were becoming sloppier, her soldiers more reckless. A nightclub shooting left 3 innocent people dead, including a pregnant woman. The public outcry reached Washington. Pressure came down hard. Task forces were formed. Undercover agents sent in. Wiretaps planted. And still, she didn't slow down. She couldn't. Because by now, control wasn't just a choice. It was her oxygen. Without it, she would collapse. One night, one of her closest lieutenants, someone who had been with her since the early New York days, went missing. Days later, pieces of him were found scattered along a stretch of I-95. His hands had been burned, teeth pulled, face unrecognizable. No one dared ask who gave the order. They already knew. But someone else was watching now. A younger, smarter, more methodical force from Colombia. The Medellin Cartel. They had noticed Griselda's empire. The blood, the recklessness, the attention. And they didn't like the spotlight. They didn't want a war queen in America. They wanted profits, not headlines. And slowly, they began to tighten the noose. Griselda wasn't just the queen anymore. She was a liability. The cocaine cowboys era had made her a legend. But now, legends were starting to die. Chapter 9. The Black Widow, Marriages, Murders, and Money. The body hit the floor with a hollow thud, bare chest exposed, eyes still wide from the betrayal. The man had come home expecting dinner, maybe a kiss. Instead, he got a bullet in the heart, fired by a man he'd once trusted, ordered by a woman he once loved. Griselda Blanco stood in the doorway. She didn't flinch, didn't scream. She just watched, cold, still, as if death had become part of her decor. She walked past the body like it was a piece of ruined furniture. Then she picked up the phone, dialed a number, and said 2 words. It's done. That was her 3rd husband, and he wouldn't be the last man to regret loving her. They called her the Black Widow, not because of the way she looked, but because of what she left behind. Dead men, empty promises, sealed coffins, and silent funerals. It was a name earned in blood, whispered with equal parts fear and awe. A spider at the center of a cocaine web so intricate, even the bravest men never saw the trap until it was far too late. Griselda didn't fall in love like most people. For her, love was leverage, a calculation, a temporary arrangement that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. And the moment it didn't serve her purpose, it was cut away, efficiently, permanently. Her first husband came long before Miami, back when she was just a poor teenage girl in Colombia. They were partners before they were lovers, smuggling cigarettes and fake passports, running petty scams through Medellin's underbelly. He was clever, sharp, but not sharp enough to see the ambition burning behind her eyes. When cocaine entered the picture, she saw a path forward. He saw a risk. That difference would end their marriage. And his life. It said that he wanted out, that he warned her to slow down, that he threatened to take their kids and disappear. 2 weeks later, he was found shot in the back. Robbery, they claimed. But nothing was stolen. Just a message left in blood. She didn't mourn. She inherited money, connections, and control of his early smuggling network. That's where it began. The pattern. The power moves wrapped in rings and whispered vows. Griselda didn't choose weak men. She chose ambitious ones, then devoured them. Her second husband helped her build the real empire. He was with her through the move to the U.S., helped arrange the first major shipments into New York. He was smart, charming, good with people. But he made one mistake. He believed he was an equal. By the time the business reached 7 figures a week, he started asking questions, challenging her decisions. He wanted more power, more say, more control. That was his fatal flaw. He was found in a motel room outside Queens. Shot in the head. No sign of forced entry. Just a suitcase full of cash and a note scrawled in Spanish. Trust no one. Griselda didn't attend the funeral, but she did send flowers. White orchids, his favorite. By the time she married her 3rd husband, she had already become a legend. Cocaine Queen. Miami's most ruthless. The money was flowing faster than banks could count it, and her enemies were dying faster than police could tag them. But still, she wanted someone at her side. Not for love, for optics, for insulation, and maybe, in some deep, buried place, for loyalty. But loyalty doesn't survive in a world where fear reigns. He started cheating. Griselda knew before he even tried to hide it. He moved sloppy, started keeping secrets, making side deals. Maybe he thought he could escape, that she was too distracted with empire building to notice. She wasn't. She ordered the hit herself, had him killed in their own home, while one of their sons watched from the hallway. The boy never spoke of it again, never cried, just buried the trauma under silence and wealth. That was the cost of being her child. You didn't inherit memories. You inherited ghosts. The media latched onto the Black Widow nickname after that. It stuck. It fit. Because by then, it wasn't just about husbands. It was about anyone who got too close. Her lovers, her friends, even her family. If they posed a threat, real or imagined, they were removed. No trials, no negotiations, just a nod from Griselda and a new grave in the Everglades. But she wasn't reckless. Each death served a purpose. A husband gone. That meant she got the entire cut. No shares, no dissent, no witnesses. She didn't just kill for revenge, she killed for efficiency. Marriage, to her, was never about emotion. It was a business arrangement, like a contract with fine print soaked in blood. And when it expired, she enforced the clause herself. Some said she enjoyed the power too much, that there was a sadistic streak buried beneath her calm. Others believed she hated weakness, that betrayal, even emotional, disgusted her. The truth was likely somewhere in between. She didn't want devotion. She wanted obedience. One man tried to propose, on his knees, ring in hand. She laughed, not because she was touched, because she already knew she'd have him killed within a year. There was a rumor that she once had a man executed simply for calling her by a pet name in front of her crew. Baby. One word. One mistake. His body was found a week later, buried in sand, his tongue removed. No one called her baby after that. Despite the carnage, she remained untouchable, because the money insulated her. Her power didn't just come from fear, it came from liquidity. She could buy silence, loyalty, police reports, judges. Every time a husband died, her net worth climbed. Every marriage, every death, was a rung on her ladder to the top. She didn't climb with hands. She climbed with coffins. The DEA watched with growing unease. They saw the pattern but couldn't prove it. Too many layers. Too many silent witnesses. Griselda left no fingerprints. No documents. Just the trail of men who once kissed her and now rotted beneath the soil. But cracks were beginning to show. Her paranoia deepened. She stopped trusting even her inner circle. Installed cameras in every room. Made her children taste her food before she ate. She stopped sleeping in the same house 2 nights in a row. Her marriages may have ended in death, but they left scars. Not visible ones, emotional ones. Deep, jagged cuts across her sense of safety. She had built her empire on loss, and it haunted her. One night, during a rainstorm, she sat alone in a hotel penthouse. No guards, no crew, just her and a drink. She looked out over the city, the lights blurred through the wet glass. A maid entered to clean, and Griselda spun, gun drawn, finger on the trigger. It took her a full 10 seconds to lower it. That's who she had become. Even alone, she expected betrayal. The nickname Black Widow wasn't just tabloid flair anymore. It was a prophecy, a reflection of the life she chose. She wove her web with promises, then consumed those who dared to get close. And yet, despite the blood and betrayal, she wasn't done. She still had power, still had reach, still had scores to settle. But there was a rumor circling the city. Something quiet, ominous, the kind of whisper that crawled up your spine when you least expected it. A name, a new name, someone watching her, waiting. And for the first time in years, Griselda Blanco wasn't sure who the hunter was anymore. Chapter 10, The Corpse Count Rises, Murder as Business. The motorcycle eased through the late afternoon traffic, blending in with the noise and smog of downtown Miami. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across shop windows and cafe tables. No one paid attention to the rider. No one saw the second man on the back, calm, precise, holding something wrapped in a towel. At the red light, the target stepped off the curb. 2 shots rang out. Clean. Controlled. Both to the head. The rider didn't flinch. The bike never stopped. And within 30 seconds, they were gone. Another ghost team disappearing into the chaos Griselda Blanco had engineered. The man they just killed had missed a delivery deadline. That was his crime. That was his sentence. Under Griselda, murder wasn't personal, it was policy. She didn't believe in warnings. She believed in endings. And her favorite weapon wasn't a gun or a knife. It was fear. Not the loud, frantic kind. The quiet kind. The kind that spread wordlessly, like smoke under a door. The kind that made men whisper her name, but never say it out loud. Griselda's empire wasn't built with money alone. It was built on blood. Brick by bloody brick. She didn't just use violence. She perfected it. Assassination wasn't sloppy. It was streamlined, organized, practiced like choreography. Her killers were trained, disciplined, emotionless. And if they flinched, if they hesitated, she replaced them. Her orders were rarely spoken aloud. She had a language all her own. A sideways glance meant watch him. A raised eyebrow meant follow through. A silent nod across a crowded club could mean end his life before sunrise. And it always got done. By the early 1980s, Miami was drowning in cocaine and corpses. The murder rate was triple the national average. Drug killings happened at gas stations, grocery store parking lots, outside preschools. The city wasn't just dangerous, it was unraveling. And at the dark heart of that storm was Griselda Blanco, issuing kill orders from her velvet-cushioned thrones and candlelit safe houses. She didn't keep score. She kept silence. Drive-by shootings became her signature. Cars would roll up slowly. A window would slide down. Then came the thunder. An Uzi, a Mac, 10, sometimes 2 at once. Then the screech of tires and the wail of sirens. She liked drive-bys because they were theatrical, public, loud. They weren't just executions, they were declarations. A way of saying, I'm here, I'm watching, and I don't miss. But her true innovation was in the motorbike hit squad. Colombian style. Fast. Surgical. 2 men on a motorcycle, the driver and the shooter. The shooter always in back, always masked, always ready. They were ghosts on wheels, able to glide through traffic, vanish down alleyways, disappear into Miami's maze of sprawl and sunlight. They could kill you while your daughter sat beside you at a red light. And Griselda made sure people knew that. Fear was her currency. It bought silence. It bought compliance. And it bought her time. Because the more terrified people became, the less likely they were to betray her. But terror alone isn't sustainable. Eventually, even fear gets tired. So she doubled down. She started targeting not just rivals, but their families. Sons, wives, mistresses. No one was off limits. One of her distributors once skimmed $5,000 off a delivery. Griselda found out. She didn't go after him. She went after his brother. In front of his mother. 2 shots to the chest. Griselda called it insurance. Everyone else called it madness. But it worked. Informants dried up. Witnesses refused to testify. Even hardened killers began to break under the pressure. Some ran. Some hid. Some simply vanished, swallowed whole by the very network they once served. The police knew who she was. They had a name, a file, even grainy photos. But knowing and proving were different beasts. She never pulled a trigger herself. Never left a paper trail. She was a ghost in fur coats, whispering commands through veils of incense and cigarette smoke. The few who tried to flip on her didn't live long enough to testify. She was everywhere, and nowhere. And as the bodies piled up, so did the respect. Because in the criminal underworld, death is language. And Griselda spoke it fluently. But not everyone saw her as untouchable. Other cartels were watching. Not just in Miami, but in Medellin, Cali, Mexico. And what they saw disturbed them. They didn't mind the blood. They minded the attention. Griselda was loud. Flashy. Her murders were turning heads in Washington. Drawing too much heat. And worse, she wasn't sharing power. She wasn't a partner. She was a threat, and that made her dangerous in the wrong way. There were whispers that the Medellin cartel had discussed eliminating her. Quietly, permanently. But no one dared move just yet, because no one knew what she might do in return. She once ordered the killing of 3 men in 3 different cities on the same day, just to prove a point. Just to show she could. Power, to her, was like gravity. You didn't ask for it. You became it. And that gravity pulled others in. Dealers, soldiers, and eventually, her own children. By the time her eldest son turned 16, he had already watched his mother order more executions than most career criminals commit in a lifetime. He carried a gun, drove a sports car, and gave orders to grown men. Not because he wanted to, because he had to. It was survival. That was Griselda's version of family. Not warmth, not love, loyalty, soaked in red. One of her youngest sons once asked her why she had to kill so many people. She told him, without blinking, "Because if I don't, they'll kill me." That was the code, the foundation. Strike first, strike fast, strike without mercy. But with every killing, her world grew smaller. Her allies fewer, her days more numbered. The streets were changing. New players were rising. Younger, sharper, more business-minded. They wore suits instead of chains, cut deals instead of throats. And they didn't fear Griselda the way the old guard did. They studied her. They learned from her. And they planned for the day she would fall. The DEA was learning too. They tracked her movements, connected dots, linked murders. They built a timeline, a dossier, a list of names, most of them now dead. But a few were still breathing. And one of them was ready to talk. He had been part of her inner circle, a trusted hitter, the kind of man who once swore he'd never betray her. But fear ages poorly, and the promise of freedom had a funny way of making men honest. He gave them details, names, dates, targets, enough to start a real case. Not just suspicion, evidence. And once the walls began to close in, they closed fast. Surveillance teams, wiretaps, photos, confidential informants embedded in her supply lines. Still, she didn't slow down. If anything, she killed more. As if she believed she could outrun the storm by adding thunder of her own. But storms don't listen to threats. They just arrive. One afternoon, her driver pulled up to a shopping plaza in Coral Gables. She sat in the back seat, sunglasses on, calm as ever. Across the street, a DEA agent watched through binoculars and whispered, "We've got her." But Griselda didn't know that yet. She still thought murder could solve anything. Still believed fear could fix everything. Still thought she was invincible. But time has no favorites. And death has no loyalty. And the next time someone stepped off a motorbike, the bullet wouldn't be for one of her enemies. It would be aimed straight at her. Chapter 11. The Hitmen of Blanco, Rivi Ayala, and the Death Squad. The baby never had a chance. It was a warm afternoon in Miami. A mother and her toddler sat in the front seat of a modest station wagon. Windows cracked. The radio playing softly. A quick errand. An ordinary day. Then a motorcycle rolled up beside them at the red light. 2 men. One driving. The other lifting a silenced Mac 10 from under his jacket. No hesitation. No mercy. The mother was the target. The child was collateral. A mistake, maybe. Or maybe not. Griselda Blanco didn't believe in clean lines. She believed in warnings, loud ones. The kind you couldn't forget. The shooter was Jorge Ayala. They called him Rivi. He didn't flinch. Not when the blood hit the windshield. Not when the tires peeled out. And not when the city later recoiled in horror. Rivi was Griselda's favorite. Her go-to. Her reaper in a silk shirt. And this was only the beginning. Griselda didn't just hire killers. She built them, groomed them, fed them power, dressed them in gold, and taught them the art of vanishing after murder. These weren't street thugs. They were trained executioners. Her inner circle of death. Her personal death squad. At the center stood Rivi, charming, ruthless, and terrifyingly efficient. He smiled in photos, wore designer cologne, flirted with waitresses. But behind the soft eyes was a man who could shoot a father in front of his daughter without blinking. And Griselda adored him for it. Their relationship was transactional, like everything in her world. Loyalty bought in bullets. Trust earned through corpses. She paid well, lavished her hitmen with cash, clothes, women. But the price of betrayal was steep and final. Rivi rose quickly through the ranks. Not just because he was good, but because he enjoyed it. He once said, "It's not personal. It's just business." And to Griselda, that was music. She didn't want remorse. She wanted results. By the early 1980s, Rivi and his crew were ghosts with guns. They moved through Miami like a shadow army, executing rivals, silencing witnesses, cleaning up loose ends. They used motorcycles, sedans, even ambulances to blend in. And when they struck, it was with surgical precision. One dealer was gunned down at a stoplight. 3 bullets to the head, each spaced perfectly. Another was killed while walking his dog. No witnesses, no sound, just a quiet fall into the grass. Their favorite tactic was the double tap. 2 shots, one to drop the target, one to make sure they stayed down. Every hit was a message. Every body was punctuation. Griselda gave orders. Rivi delivered headlines. Sometimes, the killings were creative. A rival was tied up in a motel, stabbed 57 times, and left with a rose in his mouth. Another was found duct-taped in a trunk with a note reading, "Late again." To the outside world, it looked like chaos. But inside Griselda's kingdom, it was choreography. Rivi didn't ask why. He asked when. And as long as the money came, the bullets flew. But it wasn't just about business. Griselda trusted Rivi with more than murder. He became a confidant, a shadowy extension of her paranoia. He watched her enemies, her lovers, sometimes even her children. He once killed a man Griselda suspected of sleeping with one of her maids. That man turned out to be her cousin. She didn't blink. The Black Widow never wept for the web. But power breeds delusion. And even Rivi had his limits. He started getting sloppy, showing off, flashing cash at clubs, telling women who he worked for. One night, drunk and high, he told a dancer that he ran Miami. That dancer was wired. The DEA had been circling for months. They didn't need proof of every murder. They just needed one crack, one loose thread. Rivi was that thread. They flipped him in a jailhouse phone call. Promised protection, a new identity, a life beyond the blood. At first, he resisted, swore loyalty, claimed he'd never speak her name. But isolation breaks bones no one can see. And eventually, the silence turned into confessions. What he gave them was a blueprint of hell. Dozens of names, exact locations, murder methods, payment structures, code phrases, drop houses, car rentals, stolen weapons. His memory was terrifying. He remembered every killing like it was a song lyric. The DEA recorded everything. One tape had Rivi laughing while describing how he shot a man in a parking garage, then ate a sandwich minutes later. Another had him detailing how Griselda tested new hitmen by making them kill a stranger at random. It wasn't a myth. It was a machine. A murder-for-hire assembly line with Griselda at the top. Rivi's testimony blew the case wide open. He became the prosecution's golden key, their bridge into Griselda's black empire. And with every word he spoke, the legend of the Godmother began to crack. But not without consequence. Word leaked that Rivi was cooperating. From his cell, he heard the whispers, knew the price on his head. Griselda, even behind bars, still had reach, still had ears, still had men willing to kill just to win back her favor. Rivi started sleeping with a shiv under his pillow. Refused to eat meals he didn't watch being cooked. Refused to walk in the yard without 2 guards. The hunter had become the hunted. And Griselda? She didn't rage, didn't panic. She smiled. Because to her, loyalty was never permanent. It was rented, and Rivi had stopped paying. Still, his words carried weight. In court, his testimony brought the jury into Griselda's world of blood and whispered commands. He spoke calmly, like someone recalling old business deals. His tone didn't shake. His eyes didn't wander. He had killed for her. Now he was burying her. The prosecutors leaned on him for everything. He became the spine of their case. His story was impossible to ignore. Too vivid. Too real. But there was one thing he never revealed. Why he followed her so blindly. Why he killed without pause. Why he gave her everything. Maybe it was power. Maybe fear. Maybe the love of chaos. Or maybe, like Griselda, he just liked the silence that came after a gunshot. To this day, Rivi's body count is debated. Some say 20. Others say over 50. The truth is, no one knows. Not even him. Because when murder becomes routine, memory dissolves. He once said, "You stop counting after a while. It's just noise." Noise. That was what the death squad became. White noise beneath the soundtrack of Miami's cocaine era. A hum of violence. A rhythm of execution. Griselda had turned murder into music, and Rivy was her conductor. But even conductors lose their audience. The tapes Rivy recorded didn't just detail killings. They revealed Griselda's paranoia, her cruelty, her obsession with control. She ordered hits on ex-lovers, crooked cops, even a man who simply showed up late with her groceries. One note from the recording stood out. Griselda had been planning to kidnap the children of John F. Kennedy Jr. and hold them for ransom. Pure madness. A final reach for terror in a world already burning. The plot never happened, but the fact that it was even discussed shattered any remaining illusions. Griselda Blanco wasn't just a queen pin. She was a tyrant of blood, and with Rivy's help, the world finally saw it. But the story didn't end with testimony, because Rivy still breathed, still walked, still watched over his shoulder. And Griselda? She had one name left on her list. His. The chapter was closing, but the next bullet might not come from the past. It might already be on its way. Chapter 12, Blood in the Streets, Miami's drug war peak. The sirens didn't even make people flinch anymore. They screamed past palm-lined boulevards, slicing through the humid Miami air like clockwork. Another murder. Another hit. Another body sprawled on asphalt, eyes wide, blood soaking into sun-baked pavement. It was Tuesday. The city didn't even blink. By 1981, Miami wasn't just importing cocaine, it was importing death. And the streets weren't neighborhoods anymore. They were battlefields. Open-air war zones littered with bullet shells, shattered windshields, and grieving families. No one was safe. Not the dealers. Not the buyers. Not the children walking to school or the tourists sipping cocktails by the marina. Everyone was just one bad glance or missed payment away from vanishing. Behind the curtain of this chaos stood a woman whose name was whispered like a ghost story, Griselda Blanco. The Godmother. The Black Widow. A queen crowned in blood and fear. And in this chapter of Miami's descent, her shadow touched everything. It began with a funeral. A modest one, at first. A small-time runner turned up dead in a motel room off Biscayne Boulevard. 2 bullets to the head, execution style. A message, clearly. His family wept, police shrugged, and the city kept moving. Then came the retaliation. Within days, 3 more were dead. All shot in public. One in a barber shop. One in front of his mother's house. The third at a red light, gunned down while his toddler sat in the back seat. His killer never even looked back. Griselda didn't need to pull the trigger. She just needed to let the war breathe. Her rivals wanted territory. She wanted dominance. And so the bloodletting escalated. Colombian hitmen, sicarios, rained bullets on street corners from the backs of motorcycles, disappearing before police could react. Families were slaughtered over debts as small as $10,000. Cars exploded in shopping mall parking lots. Enemies were found with their throats slit, stuffed in trunks, left with notes that read, "La Madrina sends her love." Miami's homicide rate shattered records. 300 drug-related murders in a single year. Hospitals reinforced their ER windows with steel. Funeral homes ran out of caskets. One morgue stored bodies in refrigerated trucks behind the building. Even the cops, hardened and exhausted, began to admit it. They were losing. And still, the cocaine flowed. Because for every corpse, there were 10 more people lining up to get rich. Griselda's empire wasn't just built on drugs. It was built on desperation. She took the poor and gave them purpose. Took women no one respected and turned them into couriers. Took teenage boys with nothing and handed them guns, fast cars, and a sense of invincibility. She didn't just create criminals. She created believers. And they killed for her like she was a god. Inside Miami's jails, inmates etched her name into the walls. La Madrina, the Godmother. In Medellin, children mimicked her ruthlessness in the streets. Dealers toasted her name over champagne and bloodstained cash. Even her enemies couldn't help but admire her. Because she wasn't surviving the war. She was winning it. But victory came at a cost. With every public killing, every broad daylight massacre, the heat intensified. Newspapers ran front-page photos of chalk outlines and grieving mothers. Television anchors struggled to describe the carnage without shaking. Miami's pristine image, white sand beaches, pastel suits, and neon lights, was cracking under the weight of its own reality. It wasn't just a crime problem. It was a crisis. A war being waged not in jungles or deserts, but in shopping centers and gas stations. And at its center was a woman who didn't flinch. Griselda's power came not just from cocaine, but from fear. It was her currency, her language, her religion. When one of her lieutenants suggested cutting back on the violence to lower attention, she had him shot in the face, at close range, in front of his girlfriend. She didn't believe in mercy. She believed in momentum. The more bodies dropped, the more respect she earned. The more fear she created, the more untouchable she became. One afternoon, in the heart of Little Havana, a local drug dealer who owed her money was shot in front of dozens of witnesses. Two men rode up on a motorcycle. The passenger pulled a MAC-10 from his jacket and fired 16 rounds into the man's chest. The crowd screamed. A fruit cart overturned. Children ran. The killers vanished. It took police 40 minutes to arrive. By then, the scene had gone quiet. Just another bloodstain soaking into the sidewalk. Another ghost added to Miami's swelling list. This wasn't just violence. This was strategy. Shock and awe. Fire and silence. And in the wreckage, Griselda's grip only grew tighter. The streets were afraid. The cartels were afraid. Even her own soldiers, who carried out the killings, lived in terror that they'd be next. One courier, a young woman from Colombia, missed a flight with a shipment concealed in lingerie. She thought she was safe. Thought Griselda wouldn't care about one day's delay. Days later, her body was found wrapped in plastic in the Everglades. Her fingernails had been torn out. Griselda didn't tolerate mistakes. She didn't need trials. She didn't need courts. She only needed a name. And when she got it, someone disappeared. The DEA began calling her the most dangerous woman in the world. Not just for her role in the drug trade, but for the scale of her violence. She wasn't a trafficker. She was a general in a war of ghosts. A woman with an empire built on execution and silence. But something had begun to shift. With every shooting, the city's patience wore thinner. With every dead child, the outcry grew louder. Politicians demanded answers. Federal agents poured into Miami like soldiers on the front lines. Task forces were formed. Judges signed warrants. And behind the scenes, someone was starting to talk. The pressure was building, and the walls were inching closer. Griselda didn't know it yet, but her greatest threat wasn't the streets. It was the people within her own circle, the ones who saw her empire, knew its bones, and were beginning to think, maybe it was time to burn the queen. By 1983, the war was reaching its peak. Griselda was still orchestrating chaos from her hidden fortress, surrounded by gold and guns and loyal killers. But the streets had changed. The fear was still there, but so was the resentment. Her empire had grown so large, so violent, so terrifying, that it had begun to collapse under its own weight. Miami wasn't just a city anymore. It was a ticking bomb, and the countdown had started. All it would take was one betrayal, one phone call, one voice brave enough to break the silence. And Griselda Blanco, the woman who flooded Miami with drugs, ruled it with iron and flame, and painted its sidewalks in blood, would find herself in the crosshairs. Because even in war, no one rules forever. Chapter 13: DEA on the Hunt, Surveillance and Sting Operations. The photograph slid across the table in silence. A grainy shot, taken from 2 blocks away. A woman in sunglasses and a headscarf stepped out of a black sedan, flanked by 2 armed men. She looked over her shoulder, then disappeared into a mansion shrouded by palm trees and steel gates. The agents stared at the image. This was her, the one who had turned Miami into a war zone. The woman behind the bodies piling up on sidewalks and inside butchered cars. She was real, breathing, and still walking free. Griselda Blanco. To the public, She was a myth, a name spoken in fear and fury. But to the DEA, she had become a ghost that bled the system dry. She outmaneuvered them for years, eluding surveillance, silencing witnesses, hiding in the open. But that was about to change. The city was cracking beneath her violence. Children were being gunned down in crossfire. Hospitals were on alert. Funeral homes were overwhelmed. And the American public, for the first time, was looking to Washington with rage in their eyes and one demand: stop her. So the DEA launched a war of their own. They started small, listening, watching, digging through financial records, arrest logs, border reports. Piece by piece, they mapped her empire, her couriers, her stash houses, her lieutenants. But Griselda didn't leave fingerprints. Her commands came down through whispers and codes, passed through layers of intermediaries so dense, by the time a kill order landed, it was nearly untraceable. Still, they followed the blood. Agents began staking out funeral homes, listening to conversations in jail cells, tapping phones in Spanish, then translating the chaos. Surveillance vans sat parked for hours outside nightclubs, motels, and waterfront mansions. Cameras were hidden in ceiling fans and cigarette machines. Every detail mattered, because in this hunt, one mistake meant another dead body. The DEA learned quickly this wasn't just a cartel. It was a fortress, and at its center sat a woman who moved like smoke. They tapped into banks in Panama. They flipped low-level runners in Queens. They bribed port workers in Miami. Piece by piece, the puzzle formed. Her routes, her shipments, her lieutenants' schedules. A picture so massive it covered 3 walls of a federal war room in Washington, held together by red string and desperation. The media caught wind, of course. Headlines blared her name. Queen of Cocaine. Miami's Most Wanted. Lady Death. But no one knew what she looked like. No one outside her circle had seen her in years. She traveled under aliases, hid in luxury estates, kept only a tight circle of trusted killers around her. She didn't need to be visible. She only needed to be feared. Still, the noose was tightening. In early 1984, the DEA got their break. A low-level smuggler was caught at the Miami airport with 3 kilos sewn into a baby stroller. He was ready to face 30 years in federal prison. But he had a name. Not Griselda's, but one of her key lieutenants. And that was enough. He flipped. He gave the DEA routes, stash locations, meeting spots. He told them about coded messages, about drop-offs at Miami marinas, about the armed men guarding a home in Coconut Grove. Then another courier flipped. And another. What Griselda didn't realize, what no one in her empire fully grasped, was that fear, no matter how brutal, eventually lost to survival. People began talking. The DEA quietly planted microphones inside phone booths she used. They followed the cash flow, traced her fake identities, even monitored the toys her sons bought, tracking their GPS tags to Griselda's latest hideouts. They watched her favorite restaurants, tapped into a plastic surgeon's clinic in Coral Gables, where she was rumored to be altering her face. But she kept slipping. Every time they closed in, she vanished, like mist through fingers, and the public grew restless. Why, they asked, can't the government stop a single woman? What they didn't see, what the headlines couldn't print, was that this wasn't just any woman. Griselda didn't operate like a man. She didn't posture, didn't flaunt, didn't talk more than necessary. She ruled quietly, decisively, with a ruthlessness that struck before questions could be asked. She had people inside the system. Whispers came back to her faster than wiretaps could pick them up. Police raids were aborted. Agents found themselves shadowed. One DEA supervisor returned home to find his tires slashed and a note stuffed into his mailbox. Stop hunting her. But the agents didn't stop. They just moved quieter. By summer, the task force had compiled more than 200 hours of surveillance tape. Wiretaps, financial records, testimony from over a dozen informants. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. They needed her, in person, on record, caught red-handed, where it would all fall apart in court. So they baited her. They set up a fake shipment, 20 kilos, fresh from Colombia, scheduled to land in Miami under her crew's watch. They knew she wouldn't attend, but they needed her to authorize it. Needed to catch the voice behind the curtain. The call came through. A woman. Calm. Commanding. Spanish, with a Medellin lilt. Move it. You'll be paid at the dock. That was all. But it was enough. Voice-print analysis confirmed what they suspected. It was her. The Queen of Cocaine had just orchestrated a multi-million-dollar deal over a scratchy phone line. And this time, she didn't vanish. She stayed put. Agents tracked her to a gated compound outside Irvine, California, a long way from the blood-soaked streets of Miami. It was quiet, suburban, almost forgettable. But inside, behind the manicured lawn and white pillars, Griselda was still giving orders, still running the war. On the morning of February 17, 1985, federal agents made their move. They surrounded the home in silence. 20 men, flak jackets, weapons drawn. No warning, no sirens, no chance to run. They burst through the front door and found her in a bathrobe, sipping coffee. She didn't scream, didn't plead. She just smiled, as if she'd been expecting them. The woman who flooded America with cocaine, who ordered murders like they were lunch deliveries, who built an empire of fear and gold, had been caught without a single bullet fired. But even in handcuffs, Griselda didn't seem defeated. She walked calmly, head high, her silence louder than sirens. The media swarmed. Headlines exploded. The Queenpin falls. Cocaine Godmother captured. End of an era. But deep inside federal holding cells, as agents began preparing their case, some weren't so sure. Because capturing Griselda Blanco was only the beginning. Now came the real fight. And deep in the walls of the courthouse, hidden behind layers of witnesses and redacted files, one question hung over the task force like smoke. Would she stay behind bars? Or would the woman who turned cities into cemeteries walk free again? Chapter 14. Inside the empire, lavish wealth and brutal control. The chandelier above the marble dining table cost more than most people's homes. It glittered with diamonds, real ones, not glass, not crystal. A birthday cake sat beneath it, shaped like a kilo of cocaine, with white frosting dusted to mimic powder. Surrounding the table were men with pistols tucked under designer jackets, laughing, drinking, pretending to be kings. But none of them ruled the room. Not really. At the head of the table sat Griselda Blanco. She didn't speak often. She didn't need to. Her empire whispered for her, across oceans, borders, and bullets. At her command, drugs flew over customs in hidden compartments, through airports sewn into the lining of lingerie, and across highways inside hollowed-out car seats. At her command, money flowed in and bodies dropped. The empire didn't just move cocaine, it moved fear. And it all ran like a machine built from blood and diamonds. From the outside, it seemed impossible. How could a single woman build a network that rivaled entire governments in power and reach? But the truth was, Griselda didn't just build an empire. She engineered one. Ruthless efficiency, brutal hierarchy, endless loyalty, enforced by terror. Her inner circle operated with military precision. Couriers were trained like soldiers. Safe houses were rotated weekly. Every stash had a backup plan. Every meal had a fail-safe. Her operations spanned from Medellin to Miami to Manhattan, and even into Europe. She didn't just dominate cities. She threaded herself into their infrastructure, buying off police, customs agents, politicians. Sometimes with cash, sometimes with threats. The money was staggering. At her peak, she was making over $80 million a month. Not in promises, in cash. Stacks so high they needed entire apartments just to store them. She built hidden vaults behind bookcases, concrete bunkers beneath homes. Some walls were double-layered drywall with false backs, packed with bricks of cash behind children's bedrooms. Even her cars were armored and fitted with secret compartments. Griselda didn't trust banks. She didn't trust anyone, really. She spread her wealth like a spider web. Pieces in Panama, pieces in Swiss accounts, pieces buried in backyards. She bought homes in other people's names, used shell companies and offshore corporations to move her funds. It was a maze designed not just to confuse investigators, but to trap them. Her lieutenants knew only what they had to. No one saw the full picture. No one touched her directly unless invited. She communicated through layers, each message bouncing through 3 or 4 people before reaching its target. That way, if one fell, the others could still function. It was cartel design at its most evolved, almost corporate, but far deadlier. And beneath the luxury, the silk sheets, the Italian shoes, the diamond crucifixes, lay a brutal truth. Loyalty was purchased in 2 currencies, cash and fear. If someone stole, they died. If they talked, they died. If they hesitated, they disappeared. One courier, a woman from Bogota, was caught skimming small amounts of cash. Enough for a car, maybe a new life. She was found 2 days later in the Everglades, shot twice in the head. The message wasn't just punishment, it was a warning written in blood. Even her own family wasn't spared. Griselda kept her children close, not out of affection, but strategy. They were raised in luxury, but shaped by paranoia. One of her sons once bragged to a friend about how much money his mother made. By the next morning, that friend had vanished. Just gone. Like he never existed. The lesson was clear. Silence was survival. She even built a team of internal enforcers, her own version of internal affairs. Their only job was to watch the others, to sniff out disloyalty, to erase risk. They operated in shadows, monitoring her own people like a pack of wolves walking among sheep. Still, the wealth insulated her from reality. She had gold-plated guns, a fleet of custom yachts. Her bathrooms had bidets made from jade. She hosted parties that blurred the line between royal decadence and underworld ritual, with armed guards serving cocktails and murderers toasting to profits. But even as the money piled up, cracks began to form. Law enforcement wasn't the only threat. Rivals watched from the sidelines. Men who believed she'd grown too powerful, too unstable, too unpredictable. The violence she used to control her empire began turning inward. Her own people started to fear that one misstep, even a rumor, could end in execution. One of her trusted lieutenants, a man she had once toasted with champagne and called family, made the mistake of questioning a shipment's timing. He was found inside his own SUV, slumped over the steering wheel, engine still running. But power like hers, even when stained with blood, couldn't be stopped easily. Her reach extended beyond the cocaine. She dabbled in real estate, front businesses, even jewelry smuggling. Everything she touched turned into revenue. And everyone she bought stayed bought, until fear turned to greed, or greed turned to guilt. It was all-consuming. There were dozens of safe houses, some posing as daycare centers, mechanic shops, even tanning salons. They were monitored with cameras, reinforced with steel doors, guarded by men who had killed before. Some were so quiet, so ordinary, that neighbors never suspected a thing until the raids. The logistics of her empire were staggering. Flights arrived weekly from Colombia carrying suitcases that passed through customs with eerie ease. From there, the product was distributed to stash houses, repackaged, and pushed out across the country, Chicago, New York, LA, even into Canada. Every movement was scheduled like a symphony. One wrong note, and the whole operation risked collapse. But she kept it balanced, through obsession, cruelty, and brilliance. The DEA, once baffled by how she moved products so effortlessly, eventually realized the truth. She wasn't reacting to the system. She had created her own. And that system had a heartbeat, and it beat for profit and power. But beneath the empire's gleaming surface, something darker was stirring. Her paranoia was growing. The walls around her were thickening. She started testing her own people, planting false information just to see who talked. She held meetings in 3 different locations just to ensure privacy. Her phones changed weekly. Her number was known only to 5 people, and she carried a gun in her purse everywhere, even inside her own home. Because she knew. She knew what empires were made of, and what they eventually collapsed under. The weight of greed, the scent of blood, the sound of betrayal. And somewhere, deep in the shadows of her own empire, someone was watching, listening, waiting. Not just the DEA, not just the rivals, but someone closer, someone she trusted, someone who would one day help bring the empire to its knees. And Griselda, for all her power, could feel it coming. But she didn't flinch, because in her mind, Power wasn't about how long you held the throne. It was how many bodies you could bury underneath it. Chapter 15, Enemies Within, Betrayals and Power Struggles. The gun was small, silver, and quiet. The kind designed for secrets. It slipped beneath a jacket, into a pocket, under a breath. The man holding it was supposed to be loyal, trusted, paid. But in the world Griselda Blanco built, loyalty had a shelf life, and his had just expired. He stood in the shadows of a Miami parking garage, waiting for the car that carried one of Griselda's top lieutenants, a man who, just weeks earlier, had been laughing at her dinner table. When the taillights appeared, the man didn't flinch. He just raised the gun, exhaled, and pulled the trigger twice. The window shattered. The car coasted forward, dead inside before it hit the wall. Griselda had taught them all one thing: betray before you're betrayed. But now, that philosophy had turned inward. The empire that once thrived on fear was beginning to eat itself alive. The enemies no longer came from the outside. They were inside the circle now, sitting at the same tables, wearing the same gold chains, calling her Heifa, with voices thick with deceit. The cocaine trade had always been about power. But by the mid-'80s, that power was shifting. Younger dealers, faster, flashier, more reckless, were rising through the ranks, unafraid of the old guard. They didn't respect Griselda's name the way their predecessors did. They saw her as a relic, unpredictable, paranoid, stuck in a cycle of executions and suspicion. Some whispered that she'd lost her edge. Others didn't whisper at all. Her once ironclad network was cracking. The flow of information, once carefully curated, filtered, and secured, began to leak. Meetings were intercepted. Drop locations were raided. Someone was talking. Someone on the inside. Griselda's answer was swift and brutal. She called in her enforcers, pulled names from memory, and sent killers into the night. Bodies turned up in alleyways, warehouses, behind nightclubs. Friends, allies, old partners. It didn't matter. If she sensed a flicker of betrayal, it was extinguished. But the problem was no longer just about betrayal. It was about competition. Other factions, splintered pieces of what she had once controlled, were now acting independently. A former associate began setting up his own shipments, undercutting her prices, promising safer routes. Another lieutenant's cousin started moving product through Houston, refusing to pay her a cut. And in New York, her absence had created a power vacuum that was quickly being filled by younger, hungrier players. Griselda watched all of it with growing fury. In her mind, she wasn't just a queenpin. She was a godmother, the creator of the cocaine economy in America. Without her, there would have been no routes, no riches, no bloody streets. And now these men who had once bowed at her feet, were trying to rewrite the story. She wouldn't let them. But paranoia and control made a dangerous cocktail. She began turning on people who hadn't betrayed her yet. She suspected everyone. Old friends were tested with false information to see if it leaked. New recruits were vetted through surveillance and threats. Some insiders say she even began using spiritualists, self-proclaimed witches, to help her identify traitors through rituals and candle magic. Her power was slipping, and she was clawing at anything to hold it together. Even her most loyal soldier, Jorge Rivi Ayala, began to feel the strain. The hits he carried out became more erratic. Some targets made no sense. Some hits seemed more like paranoia than necessity. But Rivi followed orders. Until he didn't. Whispers of Rivi's eventual disloyalty were already floating through the underworld. Some said he'd started hiding money. Others said he wanted out. But Griselda, so used to controlling everything, couldn't see the inevitable, even as it stood beside her. And then came the real fracture. One of her closest lieutenants, a man who'd known her since Medellin, made a secret deal with another cartel. In exchange for territory and safety, he offered intel, safe house locations, smuggling routes, payment schedules. It was the ultimate betrayal, and it nearly worked. 3 of her shipments were hijacked. 2 safe houses were raided. One of her cousins was killed in a hit that bore the unmistakable fingerprint of insider knowledge. Griselda's rage was volcanic, but it was too late. The trust was gone. The empire she had built wasn't just under attack, it was turning on itself. She responded with fury. Dozens of executions followed, some in broad daylight, some in cold silence. A message written in blood: you do not betray the Godmother. But revenge was no longer enough. She was bleeding money. The chaos was choking her operations. Deals fell through. Partners pulled back. Even her Colombian suppliers began to question her grip. The image of the untouchable queen was fading, replaced by a woman in survival mode, clinging to a throne made of bones. The DEA, sensing the instability, ramped up pressure. Informants became easier to flip. Fear had once kept mouths shut. Now desperation pried them open. Arrests began happening faster, more precise, like surgical strikes aimed at the beating heart of her empire. Inside her home, the paranoia deepened. She stopped attending meetings in person, stopped answering phones. She shuffled locations, sleeping in different safe houses every week. Even her sons were kept at a distance. Every person, every detail, scrutinized like a potential threat. Her empire no longer moved with power. It moved with fear. And fear, as she had taught so many, is a fickle weapon. Eventually, it turns. The final betrayal came not with a gun, but with a wiretap. A former associate, arrested and facing life, offered everything he knew in exchange for protection. Names, routes, codes, connections, even details of her personal habits. What time she woke up, where she liked to shop, which phone number she used on Thursdays. The DEA was ready, and so was her fate. But in those final days of full control, Griselda didn't show weakness. Not publicly. She still ordered hits, still barked commands, still walked with the swagger of a woman who believed she was beyond reach. Even as her circle shrank, even as the betrayals piled up, she never admitted fear. Because if she did, the illusion would shatter. And in the world of cocaine and chaos, illusion was everything. Still, the cracks were there. In her eyes, in her voice, in the way she began planning for exits, for hideouts, for an empire in exile. And in the background, always, was the sound of footsteps, growing louder, closer, unmistakable. The sound of law enforcement tightening the noose. The sound of revenge knocking at her door. The sound of history preparing to swallow her whole. Because in the end, the empire she built wasn't just broken by enemies. It was betrayed by the very people she once called family. Chapter 16, The Kidnap Plot, Blanco's coldest move yet. The child never saw it coming. He was only 2 years old, just barely learning to form sentences, just beginning to understand the feel of the world, bright, unpredictable, safe in the arms of people who loved him. But on that day in 1982, Miami's hot air turned cold. An unmarked van crept down a quiet street in Coral Gables. A nanny walked hand in hand with the toddler, their morning routine no different than yesterday's. Until it was. The van door flung open. 2 men jumped out, guns drawn, faces hard. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. One struck the nanny. The other scooped the boy up like a package. By the time the scream left her throat, the van was already disappearing around the corner, swallowed by palm trees and panic. It was a move so monstrous, even the cartel world paused. Griselda Blanco had done many things. She'd ordered assassinations in daylight, slaughtered rivals in front of their families, and sent bullets into the skulls of those who whispered her name wrong. But this was something else. She wasn't just taking territory anymore. She was taking children. The boy belonged to one of her former associates, now a rival, who had dared to challenge her power. He was bold. He'd hijacked 2 shipments, cut off a distributor, and worst of all, refused to pay tribute. In Griselda's world, this was treason, and treason demanded a punishment no one would forget. Killing a man made him a martyr, but taking his child turned him into a ghost. The plan was precise, cruel, and surgical. Her crew, trained like wolves, had studied the boy's schedule for weeks, watched the family, memorized addresses, routines, patterns. They knew when the nanny took him to the park, which car seat he used, even what stuffed animal he clutched during naps. The kidnapping wasn't impulsive. It was calculated, and it was only the beginning. The call came hours later. Griselda's voice was steady, cold. She didn't raise it, didn't scream. She didn't have to. She told the boy's father exactly how much she wanted, $1.5 million. Not in cash, not in one place. She wanted it delivered in 3 separate drops, each one with a different contact, a different passphrase. If any of it went wrong, if the police were involved, if a single surveillance team got too close, she promised the boy would disappear forever. The man on the other end broke. There was no choice. But he also knew something Griselda didn't. The FBI was listening. By that point, the Bureau had been monitoring several of Griselda's associates. Wires, taps, informants. They knew she was spiraling, becoming more erratic, more violent. But even they were stunned by this move. A child? This crossed every line. Even among the savages of the drug trade, certain things were sacred. Children were one of them. Now, the FBI had what they needed, a direct link between Griselda and a federal crime. Kidnapping, extortion, threats across state lines. It wasn't just drug trafficking anymore. This was something they could finally use to build an airtight case. But first, they had to get the boy back alive. The ransom drops began, one by one, each one more tense than the last. Agents watched from rooftops, trailed from the shadows, trying not to tip the scales. Griselda's crew was sharp. They'd been trained to smell a trap. One wrong move, and the child would vanish into the black hole of cartel vengeance. But the drops went through. And on the 3rd night, the boy was returned, unharmed, but silent. His eyes were vacant, his clothes soaked in urine. His tiny body trembled in the arms of the FBI agent who carried him out of the safe house. He hadn't cried during captivity, they said. Not once. Griselda had sent her message. She could reach into any home, any city, any life, and leave it empty. Word spread quickly. In the underworld, the story became legend. Some called it genius. Others called it unforgivable. But all agreed on one thing. Griselda Blanco had no limits. Her enemies grew quiet. Some fled. Others sent word that they wanted peace. Temporary truces painted with fear. The cocaine kept flowing. The body slowed for a while. But the FBI wasn't done. The kidnapping had left fingerprints. Voices. Connections. Griselda had grown too bold, too visible. Her arrogance had finally cracked her armor. And the agents tasked with taking her down now had something they hadn't had before, momentum. They began turning her soldiers. One by one. Offering deals, threatening families, playing recordings of her voice promising death. The empire that once ran on fear was now being eroded by it. And inside her fortress, Griselda sensed it. She stopped trusting even her most loyal men. Began moving again, rotating between safe houses in Broward, Hialeah, and Kendall. Surveillance photos show her changing wigs, switching license plates, using women and children as human shields. She didn't sleep much. She didn't need to. She was awake in a nightmare of her own making. But she never expressed regret. Not for the child. Not for the fear she inflicted. In her eyes, it had been a necessary move. In her world, fear was the currency. And if kidnapping a toddler brought the empire back in line, so be it. Even the people closest to her were disturbed. One enforcer later said the look in her eyes that week chilled him. She wasn't angry, he recalled. She was calm. Cold. Like she was rearranging furniture. Like ordering a kidnapping was just part of her business strategy. And maybe it was. In Griselda's mind, the cocaine game was war. And in war, the enemy's weakness was a weapon. Their child, just another pressure point to squeeze. But there was one thing even she didn't see coming. The little boy, his father, his terrified nanny, they would all become witnesses. And the case that started with cocaine would soon become something far bigger. Because the world wasn't watching anymore. It was closing in. The news media got hold of the story. Not all of it, just enough. Drug queenpin suspected in kidnapping ring. The headlines didn't name her. But the agents leaking the info knew exactly who they were pointing toward. The pressure wasn't just legal now. It was public. Political. The kind that forces prosecutors to act swiftly and decisively. For Griselda, it was the beginning of the end. But for now, she remained untouchable. Still ruling from the shadows. Still feared by an entire continent. Still capable of anything. And somewhere, In a quiet Miami suburb, a little boy clutched a teddy bear with no idea that his short time in the hands of a queenpin had just reshaped the war on drugs. Chapter 17, Operation Godmother, DEA's Final Strike. It began with a whisper, a voice on a wire in a room that smelled of stale cigarettes and anxiety. The line crackled. The informant's voice came through, low and nervous. "She's planning a drop. Thursday. The airport." In that instant, Miami's drug war shifted. The hunt for Griselda Blanco, the woman known only as the Godmother in federal files, had dragged on for nearly a decade. Agents had watched her leave bodies in her wake, rewrite the rules of cocaine distribution, and build an empire fueled by blood and billions. She was too smart, too insulated, too cruel to catch. Every time they thought they had her, she slipped back into the shadows. Until now, Operation Godmother didn't start with guns or raids. It started with betrayal. The DEA had spent months planting seeds inside Blanco's empire, flipping lieutenants, cutting deals with frightened smugglers, and leaning hard on wounded men who once swore loyalty. They weren't saints. They were killers, couriers, accountants, and insiders. But under pressure, fear is the most honest witness. The trick wasn't just catching Griselda moving product. That was easy. Everyone in law enforcement knew she controlled a river of cocaine pouring into Florida. What they needed was her voice, her fingerprints, her command. They needed Griselda herself. One flipped associate led to another. One bugged phone led to a meeting. One meeting led to a warehouse. And from there, the web began to unravel. Every conversation was recorded. Every drop point logged. Names, dates, amounts. Every smug grin of a middleman who thought he was untouchable. It was all going into a file now inches thick and still growing. The DEA didn't want headlines. They wanted closure. And above all, they wanted to make sure she never walked free again. The final push came in the summer of 1985. The agency launched a full-scale operation with one goal: capture Blanco alive, secure the evidence, and put her on trial. But they knew what they were up against. Griselda had escaped before. She traveled with armed guards, rotated her safe houses every few nights, and trusted no one, not even her own family. She once executed a bodyguard for speaking out of turn in front of her children. Another disappeared for answering the phone after midnight. You didn't get close to Griselda, unless she let you. So the DEA devised a trap. A courier, one who had been flipped, was instructed to schedule a deal with one of her trusted lieutenants. The drop would take place at a warehouse just outside Irvine, California. By that point, Griselda had moved her operations west, hoping to cool off from the heat in Miami. But the heat followed her. Agents prepped for days. Hidden mics, tapped phone lines, surveillance vans tucked behind dumpsters and dead zones. This wasn't a raid. It was an ambush built on silence. The call came. She was on the move. Griselda had agreed to come in person, something she rarely did. Maybe it was the weight of the deal. Maybe she sensed the empire fraying. Or maybe, like so many before her, she'd begun to believe her own legend, that she couldn't be touched. The black Lincoln pulled up. Inside, she sat dressed like royalty. Not the gold-draped flash of her rivals, but quiet elegance. Designer silk blouse, diamond earrings, hair pulled back, eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses. She stepped out slowly. The air around her froze. Within seconds, agents swarmed, guns drawn, voices booming. But Griselda didn't run, didn't cry out. She simply turned toward the nearest badge and raised her hands. Calm, defiant, as if she'd been expecting it all along. The queen had fallen, but even in custody, she smiled. It wasn't over. Not yet. The arrest sent shockwaves through both law enforcement and the underworld. For years, she had been a ghost, omnipresent, untouchable. Her name had been spoken in hushed tones, her orders carried out with reverence and fear. Now, the myth stood in handcuffs, her empire cracking in real time. But the DEA still had work to do. They raided warehouses, froze accounts, and turned remaining loyalists one by one. More than 30 indictments followed. Murder, trafficking, kidnapping, racketeering. The evidence was overwhelming. And yet, there was hesitation. Because putting Griselda Blanco on trial was not like any other case. She had a reach that extended beyond prison walls. A network still intact, money still flowing. There were whispers that even behind bars, she could order a hit with a phone call. Prosecutors increased security. Witnesses were relocated. Some refused to testify. Others vanished. Still, the trial loomed. And as the public waited to see justice, one chilling question hung in the air like the scent of gunpowder after a firefight. Had the Godmother really fallen? Or was she just changing her throne? Chapter 18. The Arrest. Caught in her California safe house. It was just after dawn when the black vans crept into the cul-de-sac, their engines humming like predators before the pounce. The sleepy Irvine suburb was still rubbing the crust from its eyes, sprinklers ticking, dogs barking in the distance, birds pecking through dew-soaked lawns. Everything looked ordinary. But inside one of the beige stucco houses with its manicured hedges and closed blinds, the most wanted woman in America was asleep. Griselda Blanco didn't look like a queen pin. Not anymore. Not without the designer coats, the heavily armed escorts, or the blood-slick corridors of Miami. She'd been living under an alias, far from the chaos she once ruled. Her California hideout was quiet, pristine, anonymous, camouflaged in suburbia like a cobra in silk. But the silence wouldn't last. The DEA had been watching for weeks. They had her patterns down to the minute. They knew her children lived with her. They knew she walked to the mailbox every morning like a retiree. They knew she liked coffee, black, no sugar. They even knew the name on the lease wasn't hers. But that didn't matter anymore. This was the day. The lead agent gave the signal. A dozen federal officers, armed with M16s and body armor, surrounded the house. They weren't just expecting danger, they were counting on it. Griselda had a reputation for last stands. Rumors said she kept a pistol under her pillow and a shotgun in the kitchen. One agent whispered that she'd rather die than be taken alive. But inside the house, it was eerily still. The front door creaked open after the third bang. Flashlights cut through the dark interior, slicing across marble countertops and white leather furniture. A child's toy rolled across the floor. No gunfire. No yelling. Just the heavy, tense rhythm of boots moving through rooms. And then, they found her. She was in the kitchen. No weapons. No escape plan. Just a woman in a bathrobe holding a coffee mug, her dark hair pulled back and her face unreadable. Her eyes met the agent's, steady and sharp. Not afraid. Not surprised. It was as if she'd been waiting. They told her to get down. She didn't flinch. She placed the mug on the counter and raised her hands, the faintest smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. After all the bodies, all the blood, all the manhunts and failed stings, Griselda Blanco was finally in custody. The Godmother had been caught. They moved fast. Handcuffs, photos, evidence bags. Her sons were pulled from their beds, confused and crying. The neighbors watched from behind curtains, stunned as SWAT officers marched a robe-wrapped woman into the front yard like it was any other arrest. But it wasn't. This was history. For the DEA, it was the biggest win since they put cuffs on Escobar's lieutenants. For the agents who had chased her across decades and countries, it was a moment of vindication. But for Griselda, it was just Tuesday. In the car, she said nothing. She looked out the window as the sun rose over Orange County, lighting up quiet streets and early commuters. To her, it must have felt like watching a different planet. A world she once ruled now kept spinning without her. She didn't ask about charges. She didn't ask about lawyers. She just sat there, eyes forward, unblinking. As the cruiser pulled away, the radio buzzed with chatter. Miami, New York, Bogota, everyone wanted confirmation. Was it really her? The fingerprints would say yes. The trial was coming. But so were the rumors. Because even behind bars, Griselda's influence lingered like smoke in a burned-out room. Whispers said she still had soldiers on the outside, that she could orchestrate hits with a smuggled note or a glance passed in court. Some said her empire might still run from the inside, using her sons as pawns and her enemies as warnings. And then there was the fear that this was just another illusion, that somehow, some way, she'd escape again. But for now, Griselda Blanco sat in a California jail, silent, calculating, and, above all else, alive. For the DEA, the war was far from over, because taking down the Queen of Cocaine was only the beginning. Chapter 19, Queenpin behind bars, ruling from prison. The iron door slammed shut behind her with the finality of a gunshot. Cold air swept through the hallway, stale and metallic. Concrete walls, steel bars, fluorescent lights flickering like broken promises. This was not the palace she once ruled from. And yet, Griselda Blanco adjusted like a monarch exiled to her own fortress. In 1985, she entered the federal prison system not as a broken criminal, but as a queen without her crown, temporarily misplaced, not overthrown. For most inmates, the sound of shackles was the sound of surrender. But for Griselda, it was strategy. Her mind was already at work, mapping the terrain of the prison the way she once mapped the cocaine routes of Colombia, Miami, and New York. The Godmother had been caged, but her empire wasn't dead. The whispers began immediately. Guards noticed that certain inmates bowed their heads slightly when she passed. Commissary goods appeared in her cell without request. Letters flooded in from across the country, coded, smuggled, soaked in invisible ink. Some were from lawyers, others from soldiers still loyal to her. The DEA believed the arrest had decapitated the organization. But like any hydra, her network had grown multiple heads. She had lieutenants still operating in Colombia, in Queens, in Little Havana. Her sons were still out there, some protected, others primed to step into her place. What law enforcement failed to understand was that fear doesn't retire just because the hand that swung the blade was shackled. It lingers. And Griselda, even from behind bars, made sure it did. There were rumors she was still ordering hits, that a smuggled message through an attorney or a coded sentence over a jailhouse phone was enough to trigger bloodshed. One DEA agent recounted a chilling moment. An intercepted note from Blanco's prison mail, simple in its phrasing. Flowers must be pruned before they rot the garden. A week later, a mid-level rival was gunned down in Bogotá. Coincidence? Maybe. But those who knew her didn't believe in coincidences. She wasn't just communicating. She was commanding. Inside prison, Griselda's cell became a war room. She kept mental tabs on associates, rivals, shipments. Reports said she was bribing guards to smuggle in contraband phones, though that was never proven. What was proven was the strange movement of power within the facility itself. Fights would break out, then stop at her word. Inmates with long rap sheets suddenly found themselves under her protection. Others mysteriously transferred. She didn't rule with fists. She ruled with silence and intent. Power radiated off her like heat from blacktop in the sun. She kept herself sharp, reading court transcripts, analyzing her defense, studying the law like it was a new enemy to seduce and outwit. Attorneys rotated through her visiting hours like priests confessing to a dark saint. Her court cases were stacked high, the charges severe, multiple homicides, drug trafficking, conspiracy, and more. But even in the face of it all, her eyes never lost that slow, smoldering intensity. Her lawyers begged her to lay low, to show remorse. But Griselda had never once bowed her head in shame. She was calculating, methodical, and utterly without regret. Remorse was for the weak. She hadn't built a multi-million-dollar empire from the gutters of Cartagena by second-guessing herself. She had made herself a myth, and myths are not put on trial. They endure. Outside the prison, the drug war raged on. The Medellin and Cali cartels were now battling each other for dominance. Miami was changing, tighter borders, new task forces, more surveillance. But Blanco's legend haunted the streets like a ghost in heels. New dealers invoked her name. New killers studied her methods. She had become folklore, the devil in lipstick, the woman who made Pablo Escobar nervous, the patron saint of chaos. But inside those prison walls, time had its own rhythm. Days bled into weeks. Her body aged. Her empire thinned. Some allies turned. One of her most feared assassins, Jorge Rivi Ayala, began cooperating with prosecutors. It was a betrayal with teeth. He didn't just confess, he narrated. Names, dates, weapons, prices. He recounted killings the way a mechanic details engine repairs, systematic, emotionless. And at the center of it all was Griselda, the matriarch of murder, the boss who turned affection into contracts and disloyalty into graves. Prosecutors were giddy. They believed they had the nail for her coffin. But just when they were preparing to try her for multiple murders, everything changed. A clerical error. A sex scandal involving one of the secretaries managing taped calls. Legal missteps so catastrophic that the murder charges were dropped. After everything, she would still serve years for drug trafficking. But the weightiest accusations, the ones that would have kept her buried until death, slipped through the cracks. Some say she orchestrated the collapse of the case from behind bars. Others say she just got lucky. Either way, the result was the same. The murder charges evaporated like mist in sunlight. And Griselda? She didn't celebrate. She didn't smirk. She just kept waiting. She spent nearly 2 decades behind bars, moving through federal facilities from California to Florida. But her legend followed her like perfume. Even among other inmates, hardened women with lifetimes of violence, she was treated like a sovereign. Not because she was loud, but because she was never afraid to lose everything, including herself. Then, in 2004, the news hit like a thunderclap. She was being released. Time served. No murder conviction. No life sentence. Just a quiet end to one of the bloodiest chapters in drug history. The DEA was stunned. The media erupted. But Griselda walked out of prison the same way she'd walked in. Unapologetic, unreadable, unbent. By then, she was a ghost of her former self physically. Older. Slower. But the eyes were the same, black coals that didn't flicker. Some believed she'd re-enter the game. That the Godmother would rebuild her kingdom, this time from exile. Others said she'd retire quietly, knowing that her name alone could still open doors or close them permanently. No one knew for sure. Because Griselda Blanco, even after losing her freedom, had never lost control of her story. And her story wasn't over yet. Chapter 20. The Rivi Testimony. Star witness turns deadly. He sat in the witness box with the ease of a man who had already made peace with hell. The courtroom was silent, thick with the tension of too many secrets hanging just above everyone's head. Secrets about to be dropped like grenades. Jorge Rivi Ayala, Griselda Blanco's most feared hitman, was about to speak. And when he did, the walls of her empire began to bleed. For years, Ayala had been the devil's delivery man, cruising through Miami on motorcycles, his targets marked not by guilt, but by Griselda's mood. One phone call from her could decide whether someone walked home or left in a body bag. He had killed for her, laughed with her, and feared her in equal measure. Now, he was ready to betray her. The moment he agreed to cooperate with prosecutors, the drug war shifted. This wasn't just any witness flipping. This was the closest man to her violence. The soldier who knew where every skeleton was buried because he had helped dig the graves. But turning on Griselda was like playing chess against a hurricane. Every move risked blowback. The streets of Miami grew quiet, but it wasn't peace. It was pressure, the kind you feel before a storm breaks. Rumors swirled that people connected to Ayala were being watched, followed, and in some cases, eliminated. The state wrapped him in security, tried to hide him, contain him, but even steel bars couldn't block out the shadow of Griselda Blanco. Inside that courtroom, Ayala began to unravel the myth. He didn't just speak, he narrated. Calm, detailed, with a memory so precise it chilled the jury. He described drive-by shootings as if he were recalling a grocery list. A man gunned down outside a laundromat. A boy caught in the crossfire. A rival shot point-blank while eating lunch. Names, dates, orders, all traced back to one woman, Griselda. He spoke of meetings in dimly lit hotel rooms, of cocaine deals disguised as baptisms, of murder contracts delivered in code. He called her La Madrina, the Godmother, and described her as both seductive and monstrous, capable of laughter and violence in the same breath. The jury listened. The prosecutors smiled. For the first time, they believed they had her cornered not just with evidence, but with narrative. With Ayala's testimony, they could paint a full picture, not just of a trafficker, but of a cold-blooded architect of death. But the story was never that simple. Behind the scenes, something was unraveling. A scandal, a mistake, a weakness in the chain. Ayala, while being held in protective custody, had begun engaging in sexual conversations with secretaries working for the state attorney's office. The calls were recorded. Explicit, embarrassing, and fatal to the case. Defense lawyers pounced. They argued the star witness was compromised, that his word was no longer credible. The media caught wind. Headlines screamed corruption. What was meant to be the final nail in Griselda's coffin became a circus. Prosecutors scrambled. Their airtight narrative had sprung a leak. The murder charges, built around Ayala's testimony, began to fall apart like wet paper. Griselda, still locked behind bars, watched it all unfold with the calm of someone who had played this game too many times before. She didn't panic. She waited. And slowly, the case collapsed. One by one, charges were dropped. Prosecutors, embarrassed and exhausted, shifted focus. She would still serve time, but not for the murders. Not for the blood she had spilled across Miami. Not for the lives Ayala described so vividly from the stand. The Godmother had survived the testimony of the man who knew her darkest secrets. For Ayala, cooperation had brought no freedom. He remained behind bars, his sentence long and without end. Some say he was haunted by the things he'd done. Others say he wore them like badges. Either way, his name became a curse in the narco world. A man who broke the code, who talked. But the damage had been done. The myth of Griselda Blanco had cracked. Not destroyed, but wounded. And even though she walked free years later, she never regained the throne she once sat on so fiercely. Her power had shifted from empire to echo. Yet one question lingered, one that prosecutors, journalists, and rivals all whispered. If the state hadn't fumbled the case, if Ayala's testimony had gone uncontested, would the Godmother have finally been buried under the weight of her own legacy? We'll never know. Because the man who could have damned her became the man who unintentionally saved her. And somewhere, behind steel bars or in whispered confessions, that truth still burns. Chapter 21. The Botched Case. Phone sex scandal and legal collapse. The courtroom should have been her tomb. Years of murder. Dozens of bodies. A cocaine empire built on bullets and blood. The state of Florida was prepared to bring down the hammer with the death penalty. Prosecutors had lined up witnesses, stacked the evidence, and whispered one chilling phrase to the press. This time, she won't walk away. And then, it all fell apart. Not with a bang, not even with a bullet, but with the crackling hum of a phone line and the sound of laughter behind prison walls. Griselda Blanco had long been feared for her ruthlessness, but in the end, it wasn't power or violence that saved her. It was incompetence, a collapse of ethics and discipline so absurd, it felt like fiction. But it was real, and it began with the state's star witness, her former enforcer, Jorge Rivi Ayala. Ayala was the heart of the case. He wasn't just a killer, he was her killer. The man who had ridden through Miami on motorcycles with silencers and sunglasses, leaving corpses in his wake. He had taken orders directly from her. He knew everything. And in exchange for avoiding the death penalty himself, he agreed to talk. But Rivi had a weakness. Loneliness. Even behind bars, even after laying bare the sins of his criminal past, he craved attention. Human contact. And so, he started calling the secretaries at the state attorney's office. The same office prosecuting the most notorious drug queen in American history. The calls weren't about evidence. They weren't about justice. They were flirty, intimate, sometimes graphic. Conversations between a murderer and government employees charged with putting away his boss. No security, no oversight, just phone lines and bad judgment. Word got out. Fast. It started as a whisper, then became a storm. Tabloids ran with it. Killer's phone sex rocks Miami case. Prosecutors scrambled. Internal investigations were launched. The secretaries were suspended. But the damage was done. Defense attorneys, once desperate for leverage, now had a goldmine of misconduct. They called it a breach of ethics, a tainting of testimony, a breakdown so severe it compromised the credibility of the entire case. Inside her cell, Griselda must have smiled. Not because she orchestrated it, but because, once again, chaos moved in her favor. She had seen stronger men fall from smaller cracks. The state's murder case began to buckle. Without Ayala's testimony holding weight, they couldn't connect her directly to the blood in the streets. They still had her on drug trafficking, on conspiracy, but the murder charges, the ones that could have ended in a lethal injection, were slowly slipping through their fingers. And they knew it. Florida prosecutors started to reframe their strategy. Death penalty talk disappeared from the headlines. They offered plea deals, softened their tone. They weren't chasing an execution anymore. They just wanted a conviction that would stick. The families of the victims were furious. To them, this wasn't justice. It was a farce. A woman responsible for so much death was being spared not by mercy, but by a system that couldn't hold itself together. But the courts don't run on outrage. They run on procedure. And the procedure had been violated. The phone calls were proof. One by one, charges were dropped or reduced. Prosecutors swallowed their pride and negotiated. Griselda pled guilty to 3 counts of second-degree murder. In exchange, she avoided the death penalty and received a sentence that, while lengthy, gave her a path out of prison someday. For a woman who had orchestrated executions in shopping malls and drive-thrus, who had turned Miami into a battlefield, this was a win. She didn't need to beat the system. She only needed it to beat itself. The scandal left scars. Careers ended. Trust evaporated. The Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office became a punchline, then a case study. How could they fumble the biggest narco trial since Pablo Escobar? But beyond the headlines, beyond the politics and paperwork, sat a truth that no one wanted to say out loud. Griselda Blanco didn't just build her empire with cocaine and cash. She built it with timing, with terror, and with an uncanny ability to survive. Even when the law caught up, she didn't break. The world around her did. And in that collapse, she slipped through once again. But not untouched, not unscarred. Her empire was crumbling. Her soldiers were gone. Her enemies had multiplied. And while she may have escaped the needle, the cage still closed. Behind bars, her name still carried weight. But outside, the legend was changing. Not just the Queenpin, not just the Black Widow. She was now something more dangerous. A myth, a ghost the system couldn't kill. Yet one question echoed through the walls of the courthouse, whispered by everyone from judges to janitors. If the state can't bring her down, who will? Chapter 22, The Deportation, Return to Colombia. The gate clanked open. 19 years behind concrete walls, gone in a breath. One of the most feared women in criminal history now stood in the shadow of freedom, not with fanfare or fury, but under the hush of early morning light. She didn't walk out in shackles. She walked out in silence. It was June of 2004. Griselda Blanco, the woman once called La Madrina, the Black Widow, was being deported. No media circus, no press conference, just a quiet handoff from the United States to Colombia, as if the past 2 decades hadn't soaked Miami in blood and fear. At 61, her empire was long gone. Her sons were either dead or lost to the system. The cocaine corridors she carved had been paved over by younger, hungrier traffickers. In theory, she was finished, a ghost of an era too chaotic to repeat. But ghosts don't always rest easy. The plane touched down in Medellin. Not the Medellin of Escobar. Not the gunfire-soaked streets of the 80s. This was a city trying to forget, trying to heal. New buildings, new politicians, but old scars. And into that fragile recovery, Griselda returned. No handcuffs, no cameras, just a former Queenpin with a reputation that still whispered through alleyways and prison cells. Some said she was done, that prison had broken her, that she'd come home to die quietly, to live in obscurity with whatever fortune remained hidden in offshore accounts or under concrete slabs. But others weren't so sure. They said she'd never stopped planning, never stopped watching. Because power like hers doesn't just vanish, it hibernates. In her absence, the drug world had changed. The Colombians had ceded ground to the Mexicans. The cartels had evolved, less flashy, more corporate. Violence hadn't disappeared, but it had become business, not spectacle. Griselda was a relic from a louder, bloodier time. And yet, Her name still sparked fear. Neighbors spoke of a reclusive woman in her 60s, fragile, devout, rarely seen. Rumors swirled that she had found God, that she attended Mass regularly, that she even donated to local churches. To some, it felt redemptive. To others, it felt like camouflage, because underneath that veil of piety was the same mind that had once ordered executions like they were coffee runs. The same woman who had trafficked cocaine in lingerie, who had commanded death squads with a single word. Her life had quieted, but the weight of her legacy hadn't. Authorities in Colombia watched closely, unsure if she would slide back into the shadows of the drug trade or disappear for good. She wasn't under house arrest. She wasn't even under surveillance. There were whispers of meetings, men in suits entering and exiting discreetly. Were they old allies? New players? Or just those paying tribute to a legend? No one knew for certain. And that uncertainty was dangerous. Because if there was one thing Griselda Blanco had mastered, it was unpredictability. She could lull you into calm and then set fire to a city. Even in exile, she held cards no one else could play. Secrets, routes, names. The architecture of the cocaine underworld still bore her fingerprints. But she didn't move fast anymore. She moved with the patience of someone who had outlived the storm. Some believed she was grooming someone, perhaps a surviving son, perhaps a protege kept in reserve. Others insisted she had cashed out, that the years behind bars had finally numbed the part of her that once drank violence like water. Still, her presence alone sent ripples through Medellin's underworld. And for the cartels now in power, there was an unspoken question. Was she a threat or a ghost? The DEA, for its part, had long since washed its hands of her. They'd lost their shot. The phone sex scandal had gutted the case. The plea deal had tied their hands. All they could do now was watch from a distance and wonder if the woman they once considered the most dangerous trafficker alive would ever rise again. But Griselda was careful. She didn't seek revenge. She didn't reclaim her empire. She simply watched. And that was what terrified people most. Because you never knew if her quiet was a retreat or a wind-up. Those who'd betrayed her in the 80s, many were already dead. But a few, those who had flipped, who had talked, still lived with the paranoia that Griselda's silence wasn't forgiveness. It was patience, the kind that waited until you had stopped looking over your shoulder, until you'd started to believe you were safe. And then, that was when she struck. But now, nearly 2 decades after her last arrest, the woman who once ordered hits from her bed while breastfeeding her son was fading from headlines. The new narcos were louder, younger, and more brazen. The cocaine market was still booming, but the style had changed. Griselda didn't fit the mold anymore. And yet, she was still legend. Still the reason some traffickers carried 2 phones, 2 passports, and a loaded pistol under the seat. Because she had been the storm. And storms, no matter how old, are never truly forgotten. In Medellin, the house where she stayed remained mostly shuttered. Locals didn't ask questions. That was survival instinct. But in dark corners of cantinas, her name still surfaced, spoken softly, cautiously, not out of reverence, but out of fear that she might still be listening. Because what the world had learned was simple. Griselda Blanco didn't retire. She vanished. And sometimes, vanishing is more dangerous than dying. Because a vanishing legend can still cast shadows. Chapter 23, Life in the Shadows. Griselda in hiding. She moved like smoke through Medellin. No entourage. No armored convoys. No gunfire announcing her return. Just whispers. Fleeting glimpses. The outline of a woman who once commanded armies of killers, now cloaked in silence. They said she had found God. They said the queen pin who once flooded American cities with cocaine and left streets soaked in blood now attended Mass every Sunday, sat quietly in the back pew, and carried a rosary worn smooth from prayer. A woman with a new face carved from repentance. But if that was true, then why did so many still look over their shoulders? Griselda Blanco had vanished before, when heat closed in, when rivals circled. She was no stranger to masks. No stranger to survival. What made this time different was that she had nothing to prove, and yet everything to protect. Her enemies were mostly gone, dead, imprisoned, or lost in the shuffle of shifting cartels. The DEA was finished with her. The Miami police had long buried her files. But fear, the kind she instilled, doesn't retire with the badge. It lingers. So when rumors started to leak out of Colombia, that La Madrina had returned, that she lived a quiet life under another name, that she had turned her back on crime, few believed it. And those who did believed it only halfway. Because how do you trust a woman who ordered executions over missed phone calls? She lived in a modest house tucked in the hills outside Medellin. Guards weren't visible. She had no fleet of black Suburbans, no blaring music, no armed men lounging outside her gate. That wasn't her style anymore. But it didn't mean she wasn't protected. It meant she no longer needed to be seen. The power she carried now wasn't in bullets. It was in myth. And myth is harder to kill. She was in her 60s, frail by some accounts, reclusive by all. Neighbors said she rarely spoke. She went for morning walks when the streets were empty. She wore dark glasses, long sleeves even in the heat, and always kept her eyes on the ground. But when she passed, the air shifted. People crossed the street. Doors closed. Silence followed her like a shadow. Inside her home, the walls were bare. No opulence. No gold statues or marble floors. The once lavish lifestyle of Miami's Queen Pin had dissolved into something quiet, almost ascetic. Some claimed she had built a private chapel, that she spent hours each day in prayer, asking for forgiveness from a God she had ignored for decades. But others claimed it wasn't forgiveness she was after. It was absolution, a cleansing of the ledger, not for salvation, but for legacy. Because Griselda understood what many gangsters never did. Violence is temporary, but myth is eternal. If you control the ending of your story, you live forever. She spoke to almost no one. The few remaining members of her family still loyal to her visited sparingly. Even her surviving son, Michael Corleone, kept his distance. She trusted no one, and no one expected trust from her. That wasn't how she operated. That was never her language. And yet, in that isolation, she seemed to find something resembling peace. Or maybe it was simply fatigue, the kind that comes from running, fighting, ruling for too long. From watching everything you built get swallowed by greed and bullets. From knowing that your name, spoken or not, still caused men to flinch. The Medellin underworld left her alone. Whether out of respect, fear, or superstition, no one moved against her. She had no product. No crews, no enemies left to threaten her power. But still no one touched her. Because what if the old queen wasn't finished? What if the woman who once ordered murders in hospital rooms and driveways was simply waiting for her next move? They called it life in hiding. But Griselda wasn't hiding. She was resting, like a blade returned to its sheath, dangerous only if forgotten. Those few who dared approach her, usually journalists or former allies hoping to reconnect, never got far. She declined interviews. She refused all documentaries, all books, all offers to tell her story. She didn't want her story told. Not yet. Because she knew something they didn't. That control isn't in the telling, it's in the silence. In the years after her deportation, speculation surged. Was she funding new smuggling rings? Was she laundering her remaining millions through local businesses or foreign accounts? Was she slowly building a shadow network, handing power to a new generation of women? The truth remained buried. But bodies didn't. Every few months, someone connected to her past would turn up dead. A former mule, an old associate, a rival's distant cousin. The killings were clean, untraceable, and always just far enough removed to escape notice. But the message was there. She hadn't forgotten. And she hadn't forgiven. Church officials spoke of her devotion. They said she tithed generously, quietly funded community shelters, even sponsored school uniforms for orphaned children. To some, it seemed like redemption. To others, it felt like blood money trying to wash itself clean. Even the priests who blessed her spoke in hushed tones. Because how do you absolve someone who once turned a city into a graveyard? One priest said she wept often during confession. Another said she never cried at all. Both stories were equally believable. Because Griselda Blanco was a paradox wrapped in concrete and rosaries. She was mother and monster, penitent and predator. And in Colombia, that duality kept her untouchable. By 2010, The myth had solidified. Journalists called her the last queenpin, the final relic of an era too violent for fiction. Films were proposed. Songs were written. Even Hollywood came knocking. But Griselda didn't answer. She didn't need a spotlight. She had become the silence behind it. In the hills of Medellin, the lights in her house would flicker on at dusk, flicker off by midnight. Some nights, neighbors claimed to hear chanting. Others claimed they saw men in dark suits entering through the back gate. But no one asked questions, because in that neighborhood, ghosts were respected. And Griselda Blanco had become one. But ghosts don't just disappear. Not forever. And on a warm September day in 2012, with the afternoon sun beating down on a butcher shop in western Medellin, the silence broke. 2 shots. 2 clean, precise holes in her chest. The queen had fallen. But for now, the city was still quiet. Griselda still walked the narrow roads in shadows. Still whispered prayers. Still stared down at the ground while the world around her held its breath. Because her story wasn't over. Not yet. Chapter 24, Ghosts of the Past. Old enemies resurface. The eyes watching her weren't imagined. Not this time. She could feel them, hidden in the shadows just beyond the rusted gate. At night, when the winds shifted through the hills above Medellin, the hairs on her arms would rise, not from the chill, but from something older, deeper. A predator's instinct honed by decades of violence and betrayal. In her final years, Griselda Blanco didn't trust silence. It had a weight to it now, a kind of pressure that pushed in from all sides. It wasn't prison that had broken her, it was freedom. Freedom meant exposure. It meant enemies could circle again, and many had been waiting a very long time. One of them had waited over 20 years. He had lost a brother to her death squads in the early 80s, left face down in a little Havana parking lot with 3 bullets in the back of his head. No warning, no negotiation, just blood, heat, and silence. He hadn't forgotten. Others had lost more. A father, a son, a reputation. In her ruthless rise, Griselda had scorched the earth behind her. And the thing about scorched earth is, it never truly forgets who lit the match. Word had begun circulating through back channels. Former associates in Colombia, aging traffickers in Mexico, even ghosts of the American underworld, all quietly talking about her. The woman who had once commanded armies of killers with nothing more than a phone call. Now she was old, frail, vulnerable. And in the world Griselda built, that meant she was a target. The first note came folded into a church bulletin. Handwritten. Brief. No signature. You should have stayed in prison. She didn't report it. Didn't even mention it to the housekeeper. But she did change the locks that night. Replaced the gate. Bought a new handgun and tucked it beneath her pillow. The second message wasn't so subtle. A car parked outside her home every evening for a week. Same driver. Same timing. No license plate. Just headlights flicking on and off in a slow, deliberate rhythm, like a metronome counting down. She didn't blink. Just watched. By the 8th night, the car didn't return. But the paranoia did. It clawed at her like old scar tissue, throbbing in the quiet hours, whispering through the walls. The rumors weren't just among the criminal underworld. They were growing in law enforcement circles, too. Retired DEA agents in Miami still spoke her name with a mixture of awe and unfinished business. Some believed she still had a hand in the trade, through proxies, through shadows. Others believed she was clean but feared what she still knew. There were secrets buried in Griselda's memory that could unravel entire operations. And that made her dangerous. The whispers became warnings. Anonymous calls to local journalists. Encrypted messages on dark web forums. Cartel informants mentioning her name during interrogations in Mexico City, Bogota, and Los Angeles. One message was clear. Someone was hunting her. Who? That was the puzzle. It could have been a former rival. A cartel figure she'd embarrassed in the 80s, left alive as a gesture of mercy or oversight. Maybe even an old lieutenant with a grudge about unpaid debts or lost family. Or it could have been someone newer. A trafficker looking to make a name by killing a legend. In this world, there's always a younger predator waiting to drag the older lion off the throne. But in Medellin, locals said she began to act differently. She stopped going to church, stopped walking before sunrise, kept the curtains drawn, kept a shotgun by the front door, refused visitors, even family. The woman who once dined with killers and whispered commands between sips of coffee now lived in the tension of waiting, of knowing she had made too many enemies to count, and that one of them, maybe dozens, still wanted blood. Her last trusted confidant said she barely slept. She would sit by the window into the early hours, staring out into the fog, clutching a rosary in one hand and a pistol in the other. "God will judge me," she once said, "but I'll deal with everyone else first." It wasn't just about revenge. It was survival. Griselda knew what she had done. She knew the cost, and she had always believed she would pay it on her own terms. Not in a courtroom, not in a prison, but face to face, gun to gun. The old rules still mattered to her. She had broken men who betrayed her, but she had always respected the code, even when she twisted it to her advantage. Now, the code was coming for her. One night, someone slipped a photograph under her front gate. Black and white, grainy. Her house, taken from a nearby ridge. On the back, "See you soon." She didn't tell anyone, just called an old contact from Miami, one of the last men alive who owed her a favor. She asked him a question. Just one. "Is it them?" He paused, then answered, "Could be. But if it is, it's not just them anymore." Griselda had made enemies of lawmen, rivals, allies, even her own blood. Now, in the fading years of her life, all those pieces were converging, like wolves circling a wounded matriarch, each one waiting for the other to make the first move. And she could feel it. The walls were closing. Every knock at the door, every creak in the floorboards, every car backfiring in the distance. She lived in a cage of ghosts, many of her own making. And ghosts, when they come back, don't ask questions. They come to collect. What few allies she had left tried to reassure her. "You're untouchable," one said. "No one's untouchable," she whispered. Not anymore. That was the truth she couldn't unsee. She had survived wars, assassins, betrayals, and government manhunts. But the clock never stops. And in her quietest moments, even she knew, the only thing more dangerous than a powerful enemy is an enemy with nothing left to lose. And they were coming, not with headlines, not with armies, but with patience and precision, and just enough hate to finish what she started. In her final weeks, Griselda began sleeping on the floor, changed rooms each night, kept every light on. A woman who once ruled cities now hiding in corners, listening for footsteps that might never come, or might already be inside the walls. When her maid asked why she was afraid, she didn't answer, just looked her in the eye and said, "Because ghosts don't forgive." And then, one day, the house fell silent. But the footsteps didn't stop. Chapter 25, Death on the Street, the Assassination. It happened just as the sun began to dip below the hills of Medellin, when the city's shadows grow long, and everything looks like a memory. A woman in her late 60s stepped out of a butcher shop with 2 bags of meat. No security detail, no bodyguards, just a quiet figure, aging and hunched, dressed in black slacks and a pale blouse. She didn't look like a queen pin. She looked like a grandmother running errands. The street was ordinary, dusty, cracked pavement, murmuring traffic, children laughing down the block. Then the motorbike came. It glided past once, slow, like a shark sizing up its prey. She didn't flinch, didn't even turn her head. The motorbike circled the block. This time, it didn't pass. 2 riders, one driving, one holding a .38 caliber revolver. No words, no warning. 2 shots to the head. She fell forward into the concrete, face first. The meat spilled around her like a final, grotesque metaphor for the carnage she once commanded. Griselda Blanco was dead. And the method of her murder? A drive-by motorcycle hit. The very technique she had helped invent and unleash upon Miami more than 3 decades earlier. History didn't just repeat itself. It executed her. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Not the police who responded. Not the journalists who rushed to the scene. And certainly not the criminal world, where words spread like wildfire. La Madrina was gone. The Godmother had been executed in the exact fashion she'd once used to wipe out enemies, traitors, husbands. The same cold, quick justice she'd preached was finally dealt. Only this time, She was the one bleeding on the street. For a moment, Medellin stood still. The body lay uncovered for several minutes. A small crowd formed, some murmuring in disbelief, others in reverent silence. Few people cried. Most just stared, not out of cruelty, but caution. Even in death, Griselda carried fear like a second skin. To mourn her too publicly was to invite attention. And attention, in her world, had always been fatal. The police processed the scene like any other cartel killing. 2 slugs. 1 exit wound. Clear line of fire. No struggle. No trace. No witnesses willing to speak. But behind closed doors, investigators whispered what everyone already knew. This was a message. The hit had all the signs of a professional job. Clean. Surgical. Untraceable. The question wasn't how it happened. It was why now, and who pulled the trigger. Some believed it was payback. A vendetta that had waited 30 years to finally settle the score. Maybe a family member of one of her countless victims. A son. A nephew. A wife who had lived every day with grief, and now, finally, with vengeance. Others suspected cartel business. Whispers of debts left unpaid. Secrets she still held. Information someone feared might resurface. Then there were the darker theories. That the hit wasn't ordered by rivals at all, but by those who once called her ally. Someone cleaning up loose ends. Griselda had never left the game entirely. Even from prison, even in exile, her name carried weight. And weight, in that world, is dangerous when it shifts. When loyalties fray. When power fades. Her execution sent a chilling ripple through the criminal underworld. Because if she could be touched, no one was safe. In Miami, the news broke quietly at first. A few reporters picked up the story. Cocaine queen killed in Medellin. Short, clinical, distant. But then the phone started ringing. Old DEA agents, retired prosecutors, former associates. Everyone wanted to talk. One federal agent, now gray-haired and long retired, poured himself a drink that night and said aloud to an empty room. She finally got it the way she gave it. But there was no joy in his voice, just fatigue. Because even in victory, justice felt hollow. She had evaded so many attempts, lived through so many betrayals, watched so many die at her word, and somehow still managed to fade into old age. Until that Tuesday evening in Medellin, when time caught up with her. They say death is the great equalizer. But for someone like Griselda, it felt more like a reckoning. A full-circle ending. Poetic. Tragic. Bloody. The street where she died didn't change. No candle memorial. No graffiti shrine. Just a puddle that washed away with the next rain. And yet, her legend grew in that absence. Because while the body was gone, the story remained. The young girl from Cartagena who turned herself into a queenpin. The mastermind of cocaine chaos. The woman who dared to command men, and then buried them when they failed her. She ruled with terror, built empires, shattered families, and in the end, she died in silence. Just another body on the pavement. But unlike the others, her shadow lingered. Some say the hit was just business, that someone had finally made the calculation. The cost of letting her live was too high. Others insist it was personal, that a ghost had come to collect a debt. But the truth? The truth died with her. Because the only person who knew all the players, all the secrets, all the lies, was the woman bleeding out in front of that butcher shop. Griselda Blanco took most of her empire to the grave. No arrests were made. No charges filed. No suspects named. Just 2 bullets. And a silence that echoed through the hills. The DEA declined to comment. Colombian authorities offered little beyond a brief statement. But in Miami, in hidden corners of Little Havana, the reaction was different. Some lit cigars. Some said prayers. Others simply locked their doors and didn't speak her name. Because in their hearts, they knew. Even in death, the Godmother still held power. But as the sun set over Medellin that night, one thing was clear. The woman who brought blood to the streets of Miami had met her own in the same way. And the motorbike that vanished into the city's traffic? It never returned. Just like her. Chapter 26. Legacy of the Godmother, Queen of Cocaine and Carnage. It begins with a myth. A whisper in the back of a courtroom. a shadow behind every cocaine deal in 1980s Miami. A name spoken in both awe and fear, Griselda Blanco. Not because she was simply violent, not because she ran drugs, but because she rewrote the rules. In a world carved and ruled by men, she didn't just enter the game, she dominated it. And she did it with blood on her hands and diamonds around her neck. But now, with her gone, the question lingers like the smoke from a pistol still hot. What does a woman like that leave behind? How do you measure the legacy of someone who changed everything and destroyed everything in the process? You don't start with money, though there was plenty of it. At the height of her empire, she was moving thousands of kilos a month, each one worth tens of thousands of dollars. In a business where most players were lucky to last a year, she lasted decades. Built a transnational pipeline from Colombia to California, bribed politicians, outwitted law enforcement, buried competitors. She became, by all accounts, the first true queenpin. But legacy isn't counted in dollars. It's counted in scars. And Griselda left plenty. Across Miami, across Colombia, across the lives of the thousands she touched, willingly or not. Her name remains etched into the concrete of cities she once ruled with terror. There's a certain contradiction to her memory. On one hand, she's a symbol of power, of female defiance, a woman who didn't ask for a seat at the table. She built her own and made others beg to sit at it. On the other, she's remembered as a monster, a woman who ordered the deaths of children, who killed her own husbands, who treated human life like poker chips on a blood-soaked table. For many, she represents what happens when ambition mutates into obsession, when survival becomes supremacy. There's a story once told by one of her former bodyguards, anonymous, of course. He said she would laugh after a successful hit. Not a cruel laugh, a satisfied one, like a chess player watching the board empty out, piece by piece, until only the queen remained. That's how she saw herself, the last one standing, the lone woman in a kingdom of corpses. And yet, for all her brutality, she became a cultural icon. She was mythologized in rap lyrics, immortalized in documentaries, paralleled in movies, from Scarface to Narcos. She was a character too outrageous for fiction, and yet she was real, too savage to idolize, too commanding to ignore. Her image, the dark eyeliner, the gold jewelry, the icy stare, became a brand, a ghost that still haunts true crime culture today. And yet behind that image was something more complicated. A woman who'd survived poverty, abuse, abandonment. A mother who lost a son to gunfire, who gave birth in prison, who walked into rooms filled with killers and walked out with all of them under her thumb. She was never soft, but she was human, terrifyingly human. She loved deeply, hated passionately, trusted rarely, and when she was betrayed, she responded with fire. She didn't just embrace the chaos of the drug war. She was the chaos. To DEA agents who hunted her for years, she was a phantom, always one step ahead, always one bullet behind. To her enemies, she was a storm, unpredictable, destructive, beautiful from afar, fatal up close. To the women watching her rise from the sidelines of slums and street corners, she was proof that power wasn't just for men with cigars and scars. But her power came at a cost, and it was paid in blood. More than 200 murders have been attributed to her directly or indirectly. 200 lives erased in the name of profit, pride, or paranoia. For every fortune she built, she left a trail of funerals. For every rival she buried a part of herself. That's the paradox of Griselda Blanco. She was both a pioneer and a plague, a legend and a cautionary tale, a mother and a murderer. And as the decades pass, her story continues to twist in the public imagination. She's been glamorized, demonized, analyzed, but never forgotten. Because stories like hers don't fade. They echo. In the dark alleys of Miami, where bullets once sang her name. In the quiet prison cells where her commands still reached. In Medellin, where a motorbike finished what 1,000 enemies could not. And in every conversation about the drug war's deadliest, where her name still sits near the top. Not just because of what she did, but how she did it. With style, with savagery, with silence. She didn't boast. She didn't brag. She didn't pose for photographs on yachts or in fur coats. She let her enemies do the talking. And when they talked too much, she silenced them. Her power wasn't just violence, it was presence. That invisible chill in the room when someone says, "She used to run this place." And maybe that's the legacy that matters most. Not the money, not the murders, but the memory. The way her name still makes people pause. The way her story still commands attention. The way, decades after her death, she still feels alive. Because every time a new drug queen rises, her shadow looms behind. Every time a journalist types her name, the myth grows a little more. Every time a teenager stumbles across her mugshot and wonders, who was she? Another ember of her story reignites. She was the queen of cocaine, the Black Widow, the Godmother, and her kingdom, though drenched in blood, was undeniably hers. She didn't inherit power. She stole it. She didn't rise through favors. She rose through fire. And in the end, even when the world caught up to her, even when death finally came calling, it did so in her language. Fast, ruthless, unforgiving. She created the rules, and she died by them. That, in the end, is Griselda Blanco's legacy. Not redemption, not remorse, but domination. And the echo of a life lived at gunpoint, with no apologies.